Hey there, night wanderers and history lovers. Tonight we're going somewhere truly special. We're stepping back over 3,000 years to a time when gods walked among mortals, when the desert sun rose over the longest river in the world, and when every single day was governed by rhythms as old as the earth itself. Imagine this. You open your eyes, but there is no alarm clock screaming at you, no phone buzzing with notifications, no electric hum in the background. Instead, the first thing you hear is the soft call of an ibis bird somewhere near the water. The air is still cool from the night, carrying with it the faint smell of the river, that earthy, life-giving Nile. And as golden light begins to seep through the high, narrow window of your mud-brick home, you realize something profound. You are alive in ancient Egypt, and your day, well, it's about to begin in a way that would feel both utterly foreign and strangely familiar. So settle in, get comfortable, because tonight we're not just reading about history, we are living it. We are walking through a full day in ancient Egypt from the moment the sun god Ra begins his journey across the sky to the moment he descends into the underworld at night. This is not the Egypt of Hollywood movies. This is the real Egypt, the Egypt of workers and farmers, priests and scribes, families and communities, the Egypt that built an empire that lasted longer than almost any civilization in human history. Let us begin at dawn. The ancient Egyptians did not have a word for sunrise the way we do. To them, the sun rising was not just a natural event, it was a divine victory. Every single morning, the sun god Ra emerged from the underworld after battling Apep, the serpent of chaos, all through the night. When that first ray of light touched the eastern horizon, it meant Ra had won. Again. Order had triumphed over chaos. The cosmic balance had been restored. And so when you woke up in ancient Egypt, you were not just waking up to another day. You were waking up to proof that the universe was still working, that the gods were still protecting you. Now, where you woke up depended entirely on who you were, and here is where ancient Egypt gets interesting. Because unlike what you might see in the movies, most Egyptians were not royalty. They were not priests draped in white linen performing rituals in grand temples. They were regular people, farmers, craftsmen, builders, and their homes. Well, they were a far cry from the stone palaces we see in ruins today. If you were a farmer, and statistically there is an 80% chance you would be, you lived in a small house made entirely of mud brick, not stone. Stone was reserved for the gods and the dead. The living, they got mud. But do not let that fool you into thinking these homes were primitive. The ancient Egyptians were brilliant architects, even with the simplest materials. Your house would have thick walls to keep out the brutal midday heat. The windows would be small and set high in the walls just below the roofline to let hot air escape while keeping your privacy intact. And the floor packed dirt, hard as concrete after years of feet walking over it. The coolest part, though, was the roof. Flat. Completely flat. And in the summer, when the heat inside became unbearable, your whole family would haul reed mats and blankets up onto that roof and sleep under the stars. Can you imagine that? No air conditioning, no fans. Just you, the night sky, and the occasional desert breeze. In a strange way, it sounds kind of magical. Now, if you were wealthier, say a scribe or a minor official, your home would be a bit larger. Maybe 2 stories. Perhaps a small courtyard where your wife would grow onions and lettuce, and where the children would play. But even then, life was not luxurious by our standards. Furniture was minimal. Most people sat on the floor or on low stools. Beds were simple wooden frames with woven reed mats, and those famous wooden headrests you see in museums. Yeah, those were your pillows. Uncomfortable as all heck, but they kept your elaborately styled hair intact while you slept. And in ancient Egypt your hairstyle mattered. A lot. But let us get back to that moment of waking. The very first thing an ancient Egyptian would do before anything else was wash. And I mean this seriously. Cleanliness was not just about hygiene in ancient Egypt, it was spiritual. The Egyptians believed that being clean brought you closer to the divine. Dirt, grime, bodily odour, all of that was associated with chaos and decay. And remember, chaos was literally the enemy of the universe. So every morning you would head down to the Nile if you lived close enough, or you would pour water from a clay basin over your hands and face. No soap, mind you. Soap had not been invented yet. Instead, you would use a cleansing paste made from oil, lime and perfume. It sounds fancy, but really it was the ancient equivalent of dry shampoo. Here is something that would surprise most people. Both men and women in ancient Egypt wore makeup every single day. Eyeliner made from ground-up minerals coal was not just for looks, it actually had practical benefits. The dark lines around the eyes reduced glare from the sun, and the minerals had antibacterial properties that helped prevent eye infections, which in a place where the wind constantly kicked up sand and dust was pretty important. So you would line your eyes, maybe dab on a bit of red ochre for your lips or cheeks if you were a woman, and you would be ready to face the day. Now let us talk about one of the most fascinating archaeological sites that gives us a real window into daily life. A place called Deir el-Medina. If you've never heard of it, do not worry. Most people have not. It doesn't have the fame of the pyramids or the Valley of the Kings, but in many ways it is even more important. Because Deir el-Medina was not a temple or a tomb. It was a village. A real working village where the craftsmen who built and decorated the royal tombs lived with their families. This place was founded around 1500 BCE during the reign of Pharaoh Amenhotep I, and it thrived for nearly 500 years. The people who lived there were not slaves. Let me say that again because it is a common misconception. They were not slaves. They were skilled artisans. Stonecutters, painters, sculptors, scribes. They were paid workers. They received rations of grain, beer, oil and fish. They had days off. They had health care. And when their pay was late, they went on strike. Literally. The first recorded labour strike in human history happened at Deir el-Medina in 1156 BCE. The workers marched on the administrative offices and refused to return to work until they got their overdue rations. And you know what? It worked. They got paid. Why am I telling you about Deir el-Medina? Because archaeologists have found thousands of pieces of written material there. Not grand inscriptions on temple walls, but everyday stuff. Shopping lists, love letters, medical prescriptions, complaints about noisy neighbours, divorce records, one ostrakon, that is a fancy word for a pottery shard used as scrap paper, records a man complaining that his neighbour borrowed his cloak and never gave it back. Another one is a prescription for a scorpion bite that involves ground-up beetles and a chant to the goddess Serket. This is real life. This is what mornings in ancient Egypt actually looked like for most people. So there you are. You have washed. You have applied your eyeliner. You have maybe muttered a quick prayer to the household gods, small statues kept in a little shrine in the corner of your main room. Gods like Bez the dwarf god who protected children and brought joy to the home, or Taweret the hippo goddess who watched over pregnant women. These were not the grand gods of the temples. These were your gods, the ones you talk to every day. And now the sun is fully up. The heat is starting to build, and it is time to eat something before the real work begins. Breakfast in ancient Egypt was simple, but it was filling. Bread and beer. That was the foundation. Now, before you wrinkle your nose at the idea of beer for breakfast, understand this. Ancient Egyptian beer was not like modern beer. It was thick, almost like a liquid bread, and it was full of nutrients. It was safer to drink than water, which could carry all kinds of nasty diseases, and everyone drank it. Men, women, children. It was the national beverage. Workers at the Giza Plateau, the ones building the pyramids, were given 3 rations of beer every single day as part of their wages. The bread, though, that is where things get interesting and a little bit sad. Egyptian bread was made from emmer wheat, or barley ground on stone querns. And here is the problem. No matter how carefully you ground that grain, tiny particles of sand and grit would get into the flour. You could not avoid it. So when you ate bread, you were also eating sand. And over time, that sand wore down your teeth, where patterns on mummies show that even young people had serious dental problems, teeth ground down to nubs, abscesses, infections. Dental health in ancient Egypt was frankly terrible, which is ironic because they were so obsessed with cleanliness everywhere else. If you were lucky, you might also have some onions with your breakfast. Onions were a staple. They grew easily in the rich Nile soil they stored well, and they added flavour to an otherwise bland diet. Sometimes there would be dates or figs if it was the right season, and if you were wealthy you might have honey. But for most people, breakfast was bread, beer and onions. That was it. And as you sat there, maybe on a stool outside your door, chewing your gritty bread and sipping your thick beer, you would watch your village come to life. You would see your neighbours emerging from their homes, the women heading to the communal oven to bake the day's bread, the men gathering their tools, children running through the narrow streets barely wide enough for 2 people to pass, donkeys braying, dogs barking. The smell of smoke from cooking fires mixing with the smell of the river, and you would know deep in your bones that today would be like every other day. Not because life was boring, but because life was predictable. The Nile would rise and fall on schedule, the sun would move across the sky, the gods would maintain the cosmic order, and you would do your part. Whatever that part was. Because in ancient Egypt everyone had a role, everyone had a place. From the pharaoh who was literally considered a living god all the way down to the farmers who worked land they did not even own. Society was structured like a pyramid, rigid, hierarchical, but also strangely stable. And that stability is part of what allowed this civilization to last for 3,000 years. 3,000 years. To put that in perspective, ancient Egypt lasted 10 times longer than the United States has existed so far. So as the morning light grows brighter and the heat begins to rise, you finish your breakfast. You wipe the crumbs from your simple linen kilt or dress, and you prepare to head out into the day. But before you do, you might pause for just a moment. You might glance toward the east where the sun is climbing higher, and you might whisper a quick thanks to Ra, because he fought chaos and won, because the world is still here, because you get to live another day in the greatest civilization the world has ever known, and tomorrow, well, tomorrow the whole cycle will begin again. But we're not done yet. Not even close, because the morning in ancient Egypt, that was just the beginning. There is so much more to explore. The work, the sweat, the struggles, the social structures that kept everything running, the moments of joy and frustration, the prayers and the parties. We are just getting started. So take a breath. Let that ancient Egyptian morning settle into your mind. And when you are ready, we will keep walking through this day together. Because the story of ancient Egypt is not just a story about pharaohs and pyramids, it is a story about people. People who woke up to the same sun you do, who worried about the same things you do, who loved and laughed and struggled just like you do. And their story, well, it is still worth telling, even after all these thousands of years. There is something fascinating that happens when you really think about ancient Egypt. You realize that this was not just a civilization of monuments and mysteries, it was a civilization of structure, of order so precise, so carefully maintained that it lasted longer than almost any society in human history. And at the heart of that order was something the Egyptians called ma'at. Ma'at. It is one of those words that does not translate neatly into English. We might say truth, or justice, or cosmic order, but none of those quite captures what ma'at meant to an ancient Egyptian. Ma'at was everything. It was the force that kept the sun rising and the Nile flooding. It was the principle that prevented the universe from descending back into the primordial chaos from which it was born. And crucially, ma'at was reflected in the social structure of Egypt itself. The pyramid. Not the stone pyramids you see in photographs, but the invisible pyramid of human society with every single person occupying exactly the place the gods intended for them. Now, before we go any further, I want you to imagine something. Imagine waking up every single day knowing exactly who you are, what your purpose is, and where you fit in the grand scheme of the universe. No existential crisis. No wondering if you're in the right career or if you should have made different choices. You are a farmer because your father was a farmer, and his father before him going back generations. Or you're a scribe because the gods blessed you with intelligence, and someone recognized it early enough to get you into school. Your place in the world is not something you choose. It is something you inherit, something that was decided before you were even born. Does that sound limiting, maybe? But here is the thing. To the ancient Egyptians, this was not oppression. This was ma'at. This was the natural order. And because everyone believed in it, because everyone accepted their role as part of the divine plan, the whole system worked. For 3,000 years, let us start at the very top of this pyramid, the Pharaoh. But even calling him the Pharaoh is a bit misleading because to the ancient Egyptians he was not just a king, he was a god, literally, the living embodiment of Horus the sky god, the son of Ra, the sun god. When he died, he would become Osiris, ruler of the underworld. Every morning when the sun rose, it was because the Pharaoh was maintaining ma'at. Every year when the Nile flooded right on schedule, depositing its rich black soil on the fields, it was because the Pharaoh was doing his job. If crops failed, if enemies invaded, if disease swept through the land, that meant the Pharaoh had somehow broken ma'at. And the gods were displeased. Can you imagine living with that kind of pressure? The Pharaoh was not just responsible for politics or the military. He was responsible for the entire functioning of the cosmos. Every temple ritual had to be performed correctly. Every prayer had to be said. Every offering had to be made. Now obviously the Pharaoh could not personally oversee every temple in Egypt, every tax collection, every legal dispute. He needed help. Which is where the vizier comes in. The vizier. Think of him as the Pharaoh's right hand, but honestly that understates it. The vizier was more like the Pharaoh's entire administrative body. He was the prime minister, the chief judge, the secretary of the treasury, and the head of the civil service all rolled into one. And this position existed from almost the very beginning of Egyptian history, established as far back as 3150 BCE during the early dynastic period. One of the most famous viziers was a man named Imhotep who served under Pharaoh Djoser around 2650 BCE. You might have heard his name from that mummy movie, but the real Imhotep was far more impressive than any Hollywood version. He was not just a vizier, he was an architect, a physician, a philosopher. He designed the step pyramid at Saqqara, the very first pyramid ever built, the structure that started it all. And after his death, he was so revered that the Egyptians actually made him into a god, a human who became divine. How often does that happen? But Imhotep was exceptional. Most viziers were simply incredibly competent administrators. They woke up every day and dealt with an absolutely staggering amount of responsibility. They oversaw tax collection across the entire kingdom. They supervised construction projects from temples to irrigation canals. They settled disputes between nobles. They managed the food distribution system that kept the whole country from starving. They reviewed every official document, and each one had to bear their seal before it became law. If you were a vizier, you did not have time for hobbies. Below the vizier came the nobles. These were the people who actually ran the regions of Egypt called nomes. Each nome had a governor and nomarch who was responsible for keeping order, collecting taxes, and making sure that local temples were properly maintained. Nobles were almost always born into their positions. If your father was a nomarch, you would probably become one too. If your family owned land, you would inherit that land. And land meant wealth, because land meant food, and food was the foundation of everything. But here is where it gets interesting. During certain periods of Egyptian history, these nomarchs became too powerful. When the central government was strong, when you had a powerful pharaoh like Ramesses II or Thutmose III, the nomarchs stayed in line. But when the pharaoh was weak, when there were succession crises or invasions or famines, the nomarchs started acting like little kings in their own territories. They stopped sending taxes to the capital. They raised their own armies, and Egypt would fracture. These periods, called intermediate periods, were times of chaos, times when Maat was broken, and the Egyptians hated them. They longed for order to be restored. Now alongside the nobles were the priests, and this is crucial to understand. Priests in ancient Egypt were not like priests in Christianity or Islam. They were not there to give sermons or provide moral guidance to the people. No, the priests served the gods, only the gods. Their job was to maintain the temple, perform the daily rituals, and make sure the gods were happy. That was it. Every morning before dawn, the high priest would enter the innermost sanctuary of the temple. He would break the seal on the door of the shrine where the god's statue lived. He would wake the god by chanting prayers. Then he would wash the statue, dress it in fresh linen, put on its jewelry, and present offerings of food and incense. This happened every single day without fail in every major temple across Egypt. Because if the gods were not properly cared for, Maat would collapse. The universe would end. Some of these high priests became incredibly powerful. The high priest of Amun at Karnak, for example, controlled vast wealth. The temple of Amun owned land, livestock, gold, and had thousands of people working for it. At certain points in history, particularly during the late New Kingdom, the high priest of Amun rivaled the pharaoh himself in terms of actual power, which, as you can imagine, caused some political tension. But even below the high priests, regular priests had it pretty good. They were exempt from manual labour. They received rations of food, beer, and clothing. They were respected members of society. But there was a catch. Priests had to be ritually pure. That meant they had to shave their entire bodies, head, eyebrows, everything. They had to bathe in cold water multiple times a day. They could not eat certain foods. They had to wear only the purest white linen. So yes, they had status, but they also had to follow extremely strict rules. And now we come to a group that might surprise you in terms of how important they were. The scribes. If the priests served the gods and the nobles ran the government, the scribes were the ones who made everything actually function. Because the scribes could read and write. And in ancient Egypt, literacy was rare. Incredibly rare. Probably less than 1% of the population could read and write hieroglyphics. Why? Because learning to read and write in ancient Egypt was hard. Hieroglyphics had over 700 different signs. You had to memorize all of them. You had to know when to use which script because there were actually 3 different writing systems: hieroglyphics for formal inscriptions, hieratic for everyday documents, and later demotic for business transactions. You had to study mathematics. You had to learn proper forms for legal documents, letters, religious texts. It took years of intense education. And where did you get that education? In special schools called houses of life, which were usually attached to temples. If you were the son of a scribe, you would probably be sent to one of these schools. But here is the beautiful thing. If you were not the son of a scribe, if you were just a farmer's son, but someone noticed you were bright, you could still be sent. And if you succeeded, if you graduated and became a scribe, you had just changed your family's entire future. You'd climbed the social pyramid. There is this amazing text from ancient Egypt called the Satire of the Trades, and it is basically a piece of propaganda encouraging boys to become scribes. It goes through all the other professions and describes how awful they are. The metal worker, it says, has fingers like crocodile claws from working with hot copper. The farmer is constantly covered in mud, and his back aches from bending over all day. The potter is covered in clay like a man who's been digging in dirt, but the scribe sits in clean linen and never has to do manual labor. The scribe has the ear of the pharaoh. The scribe will never go hungry. And you know what? It was true. Scribes really did have it better than almost everyone else. They kept the records that allowed the entire kingdom to function. They recorded how much grain was harvested, how many cattle were counted, how much tax was owed. They wrote letters for nobles who could not write themselves. They copied religious texts that would be placed in tombs. They were indispensable, and they knew it. But even with all this hierarchy, all this rigid structure, there was some mobility. Not much, but some. A soldier who distinguished himself in battle could be rewarded with land. A craftsman whose work was exceptionally beautiful might come to the attention of a noble or even the pharaoh. And of course, as we mentioned, a farmer's son could become a scribe. It was rare, but it happened. And when it did, people talked about it, because it proved that Ma'at allowed for excellence to be rewarded. Now here is something I find really interesting. For all this talk of hierarchy, for all the rigid class structure, the Egyptians also believed that everyone had a role in maintaining Ma'at. Everyone. The farmer who grew the barley that made the bread and beer, he was maintaining Ma'at. The labourer who hauled stones for a pyramid, he was maintaining Ma'at. The woman who ground grain and baked bread. She was maintaining Ma'at. Everyone had their part to play. And if everyone played their part, the universe would continue. The sun would rise, the Nile would flood, order would prevail. This is why even though 80% of Egyptians were farmers living in mud houses eating bread and onions, even though their lives were hard and they had almost no political power, the system did not collapse into revolution. Because they believed in it. They believed that their work mattered on a cosmic level. They were not just growing wheat, they were maintaining the fabric of reality itself. Think about that for a second. What if you believed, truly believed, that your daily work was directly connected to the functioning of the universe? Would you do it differently? Would you show up with more purpose? The Egyptian social structure was in many ways a reflection of their deepest values. They believed in order, in stability, in knowing your place and doing your duty. And yes, we can look at it from our modern perspective and see inequality. We can see lack of opportunity. We can see privilege passed down through bloodlines. All of that is true. But we also have to acknowledge this: it worked. For 3,000 years it worked. That is longer than the Roman Empire lasted, longer than any European dynasty, longer than most civilizations even exist. There is a reason Egypt became one of the most powerful, most prosperous, most culturally rich civilizations in human history. And a big part of that reason was this social structure, this belief in Ma'at, this conviction that everyone from the pharaoh to the lowest labourer was part of something bigger than themselves. So when you woke up in ancient Egypt and you headed out to start your day's work, whether you were going to plough a field or write a letter or carve a statue or perform a ritual, you did it knowing that you were not just working for yourself. You were working for Egypt. You were working for the gods. You were working to keep chaos at bay. And maybe that made the hard work feel a little more meaningful, a little more bearable, a little more sacred, because in ancient Egypt there was no separation between the sacred and the everyday. Everything was connected, everything mattered, and everyone from the divine pharaoh to the dusty farmer had their place in the cosmic order. And with that understanding firmly in your mind, with your place in this vast pyramid of humanity settled and accepted, you would move forward into the rest of your day. There was work to be done, food to be eaten, and a whole life to be lived within this ancient, intricate, endlessly fascinating structure. The sun is climbing higher now, the heat is building, and there is much more of this day still ahead of us. So you have washed, you have lined your eyes with kohl, you have said your morning prayers to the household gods, and now your stomach is reminding you quite insistently that it needs fuel. Because whatever your place in the social pyramid might be, whether you're about to spend your day copying legal documents or ploughing a field or carving hieroglyphics into a temple wall, you're going to need energy. And in ancient Egypt, that energy came from two things above all else: bread and beer. Now I know what you might be thinking. Bread and beer for breakfast sounds like a college student's dream meal. But here is the thing. Ancient Egyptian bread and beer were nothing like what we have today. And understanding what they really were, how they were made, and why they mattered so much gives us one of the clearest windows into daily life along the Nile. Let us start with bread, because if there is one food item that defined ancient Egypt, it was bread. The Egyptians had a word that meant both bread and life. Think about that for a second. The word for bread and the word for life were the same. That tells you everything you need to know about how central bread was to their existence. Archaeological evidence from tombs shows us that the Egyptians made dozens, maybe even hundreds of different types of bread. Flat breads, round breads, conical breads shaped like little pyramids, breads moulded to look like animals or fish, or even human figures for religious festivals. Some breads were plain, others had dates pressed into them or honey or seeds. But the most common bread, the everyday bread that most people ate most days, was simple, coarse, made from emmer wheat or barley, and absolutely loaded with grit. Here is where things get uncomfortable, literally. The process of making bread in ancient Egypt started with grinding grain, and grain grinding was brutal, back-breaking work almost always done by women. You would kneel on the ground with a large flat grinding stone in front of you called a saddle quern. Then you would take a smaller, heavy stone in both hands and push it back and forth across the grain, crushing it into flour. For hours. Every single day. Imagine doing that before dawn, before you can even have breakfast yourself, knowing that if you do not make enough bread, your family will go hungry. And no matter how careful you were, no matter how many times you sifted that flour, tiny particles of sand and stone would get into it. From the grinding stones themselves, from the wind blowing across the grain as it dried in the sun, from storage in sandy environments, it was unavoidable. So when you ate your bread, you were also eating sand. And that sand would slowly, steadily grind your teeth down to nothing. Archaeologists who study Egyptian mummies are always struck by the terrible state of their teeth. Even young people in their 20s and 30s, had teeth worn down almost flat. Exposed roots, abscesses that must have caused excruciating pain. There is evidence that some people died from infections that started as dental problems, all because of the bread they ate every day. It is one of those details that really drives home how different life was back then. The very thing that kept them alive was also slowly destroying their bodies. But they had no choice. Bread was life. And so women would wake up before dawn, light fires in the courtyard ovens made of mud brick, and start the long process of turning grain into edible food. In the Old Kingdom around 2500 BCE, bread was baked in heavy pottery moulds that were placed directly in the coals. By the New Kingdom around 1500 BCE, they had developed large cylindrical clay ovens where you would slap the dough onto the heated inner walls and it would bake right there, kind of like a modern tandoor oven. The smell of fresh bread baking must have filled every village, every neighbourhood, every morning. It is one of those sensory details we can actually imagine pretty accurately, because bread smells pretty much the same whether you're in ancient Thebes or modern New York. That warm, yeasty, comforting smell that tells you food is coming, that life is continuing, that today at least you will not go hungry. Now about that beer. Ancient Egyptian beer was absolutely critical to understanding their diet, and it was nothing like the pale carbonated lagers we drink today. Egyptian beer was thick, cloudy, more like a liquid porridge than a beverage, and it was incredibly nutritious. It had calories, yes, but also protein, vitamins, minerals. It was in a very real sense food. People did not drink beer in ancient Egypt primarily to get drunk. They drank it because it was safer than water and it kept them nourished. The Nile River, for all its life-giving properties, was not always safe to drink directly. Not because it was polluted in the modern sense, but because of all the life in it. Bacteria, parasites, things that could make you very sick. But beer went through a fermentation process that killed most of those pathogens. So beer was what you drank. Men, women, children, everyone, all day long. At the workers' village building, the pyramids at Giza, archaeologists have found records showing that each worker received a ration of over 1 gallon of beer per day. Per day. That sounds like a lot until you realise that they were working in 100-degree heat, hauling multi-ton blocks of limestone up ramps, doing physical labour that would break most modern people. They needed every calorie that beer could provide, so how did they make it? Well, the process was fascinating and surprisingly sophisticated. There were actually 2 methods. The first involved baking what archaeologists call beer bread. This was bread with a high yeast content that was only lightly baked specifically so the yeast would not die. Then you would crumble this bread into large vats, add water, maybe some dates for sweetness, and let it ferment. After a few days, you would strain the mixture through palm fibre baskets, and what came out was beer. The second method was even more clever. You would take one batch of grain and let it sprout, which produces enzymes. Then you would cook another batch of grain in water, which disperses the starch. Mix the 2 together, and the enzymes start converting the starch into sugar. Then you add yeast, and the yeast converts the sugar into alcohol. The ancient Egyptians figured this out thousands of years before anyone understood the actual chemistry of what was happening. They were intuitive biochemists, and they took their beer seriously. There were different grades, different colours which indicated different alcohol contents, sweet beer, strong beer, festival beer that was made special for celebrations. Beer was even used as currency in some transactions. A skilled craftsman might be paid in bread and beer rather than anything else, and that was considered perfectly acceptable payment because those 2 things were what you actually needed to survive. But bread and beer were just the foundation. What else did you eat for breakfast? Well, if you were a typical farmer or labourer, you would probably have onions. Onions were everywhere in ancient Egypt. They grew easily in the Nile soil, they stored well, and they added some flavour to an otherwise pretty bland diet. Green onions specifically. You would eat them raw right there with your bread and beer. Have you ever eaten raw onions first thing in the morning? The ancient Egyptians did. Every day. Which means that everyone's breath must have been absolutely terrible. But at least everyone was equally onion-scented, so maybe no one noticed. It is these little details that make history feel real, you know. Not the grand monuments or the powerful pharaohs, but the fact that an entire civilization started their mornings with onion breath. If it was the right season, you might also have some fruit. Dates, probably. Figs, if you were lucky. The Egyptians loved dates. They ate them fresh. They dried them for storage. They made them into paste for sweetening other foods. A painting from a tomb in Saqqara from around 2300 BCE shows a complete meal that had been left for a nobleman in the afterlife. Among other things, there was a dish of stewed figs. Figs and dates were special, though. Everyday breakfast was more likely just bread, beer and onions, unless you were wealthy. If you were a noble, a high-ranking scribe, a priest with access to temple stores, your breakfast might include honey. Real honey collected from wild bees or from bees kept in pottery hives. Honey was expensive, a luxury item, but oh, imagine how different that bread must have tasted with honey drizzled on it. Suddenly it would not just be fuel, it would be pleasure, and if you were very, very wealthy, you might have some cheese. The Egyptians made cheese from cow's milk and goat's milk, probably something similar to cottage cheese. Archaeologists have actually found preserved cheese in tombs, which is both fascinating and slightly horrifying. 3,000-year-old cheese. But it proves they were making it eating it, and considering it valuable enough to take into the afterlife. But let us be honest here. For most people, breakfast was not about luxury or variety or pleasure. It was about getting enough calories to make it through a hard day of work, and bread and beer delivered those calories efficiently and relatively cheaply. You could make bread and beer at home. Women did it every day. In fact, bread making and beer brewing usually happened in the same place, because they used the same yeast. Every household was its own little bakery and brewery. And if you were really poor or really busy, you could buy bread from a professional baker. Bakeries existed in ancient Egypt. We have archaeological evidence of them. They would bake large quantities of bread and sell it to workers, to people without ovens, to anyone who had something to trade. Usually grain, since most transactions were barter-based. No coins, no paper money, just, I will give you this much barley for that many loaves. There is something almost comforting about that simplicity, is there not? You wake up. You eat bread that was made by someone in your community from grain that was grown in fields you can see from your house. You drink beer that was brewed using water from the river that flows right past your village. Everything is local. Everything is immediate. There is no wondering where your food came from or what might be in it. You know. You can see the whole process. Of course, there was a dark side to this. When the harvest was bad, when the Nile flood was too low or too high, when locusts came, there was no backup plan. No imported grain from other countries, at least not for regular people. Famine was a real and terrifying possibility. There are records from periods of crisis describing people eating things they normally would not eat, desperately searching for any source of calories. During the first intermediate period around 2200 BCE, there are inscriptions describing people so hungry they were eating their own children. That may be exaggeration, propaganda, or metaphor, but the fact that such language was used tells you how traumatic those food shortages were. But on a normal morning during a normal year when the system was working as it should, breakfast was simple and sufficient. You would sit outside your house, maybe on a low stool, maybe just on the ground. The sun would be climbing higher, the heat building. Your neighbours would be doing the same thing. Children would be running around their morning chores, done ready to start whatever education or play their day would bring. Dogs would be begging for scraps. Cats, which the Egyptians domesticated and loved, would be prowling around looking for mice. And you would eat your bread, rough and gritty as it was. You would drink your beer, thick and nourishing as it was, and you would steel yourself for the day ahead. Because in ancient Egypt, like everywhere else in human history, most of life was work. Hard, physical, unrelenting work. The work of survival. The work of maintaining your place in the cosmic order. The work of keeping Mayat intact. But before you head out to the fields or the workshop or the temple, there is one more thing worth thinking about. Food in ancient Egypt was not just about nutrition. It was deeply tied to religion, to the afterlife, to their entire worldview. Every meal was in a sense a religious act. You were consuming the gifts of the gods. The bread came from grain that grew because the gods made the Nile flood. The beer was transformed by a process that must have seemed almost magical. The onions, the dates, the honey, all of it was evidence that the gods were providing for you. And so before you took your first bite, you might whisper a quick thank you to the gods. Nothing formal, nothing elaborate, just an acknowledgement. Because in ancient Egypt you never forgot that your life, your food, your very existence was all dependent on forces far greater than yourself. With your belly full, or at least as full as it is going to get you, rise. The morning is moving on, there is work to be done. And whether that work is ploughing fields under the hot sun, or recording tax payments in a cool office, or performing rituals in a temple, it is time to begin. The day is waiting. And in ancient Egypt you do not waste daylight. The sun is higher now, climbing steadily into that pale blue Egyptian sky. The coolness of dawn has burned away completely, and you can already feel the heat starting to press down like a heavy blanket. If you are one of the 80% of Egyptians who work the land, this is the moment you have been preparing for since you opened your eyes. This is when you head out to the fields. And depending on what time of year it is, depending on where you are in the eternal cycle that governs all life in Egypt, your work today could be very different from your work last month or next month. Because here is something fascinating about ancient Egypt that most people do not realize. The Egyptians did not think about the year the way we do. They did not have summer, fall, winter, spring. No, they had 3 seasons. Just 3. And all 3 were defined not by temperature or daylight, but by one thing and one thing only. The Nile River. That massive, powerful, utterly essential river that turned a strip of desert into the most productive farmland in the ancient world. The 3 seasons had names: Akhet, Pere, Shimu. And if you were a farmer, these 3 words structured your entire existence. They told you when to plant, when to harvest, when to rest, and perhaps most importantly, when you would be taken away from your own fields to work for the pharaoh. Let me walk you through them, because understanding these seasons is understanding the heartbeat of ancient Egypt. Akhet, the season of inundation. This was the first season of the year, running roughly from June through September by our modern calendar. An inundation is a perfect word for it, because that is exactly what happened. The Nile would flood. Not occasionally, not unpredictably. Every single year, like clockwork, the river would swell and rise and spill over its banks, covering the fields, in water sometimes 5 feet deep, mile after mile of farmland completely submerged. Now, if you're thinking flood equals disaster, you would be wrong, at least in Egypt. This flood was the most important event of the entire year, because when that water finally receded, it left behind something magical. Silt. Black, rich, incredibly fertile silt that had been carried all the way from the highlands of Ethiopia, from the heart of Africa down the Nile, and deposited right here on Egyptian farmland. The Egyptians even had a special name for this soil: Kemet, the Black Land. And Kemet was the reason Egypt could feed millions of people for thousands of years. But during Akhet itself, while the fields were still underwater, you could not farm, obviously. So what did farmers do during these 4 months? Well, some of them stayed home and repaired tools, wooden ploughs that had cracked during the last planting season, hoes with worn edges, sickles that needed sharpening. They would check on their homes, reinforce the mud bricks if the last flood had damaged them, tend to any animals they owned. Goats, maybe a couple of cows if they were fortunate, donkeys that would be essential for hauling things once work resumed. But many farmers, probably most farmers, did something else during Akhet. They were conscripted, taken from their homes and put to work on state projects, building temples, cutting stone in quarries, hauling massive blocks for pyramids. This was called corvée labour, and it was not optional. When the pharaoh's officials showed up at your village and said, "We need men for the royal tomb," you went. You had no choice. Now Hollywood has done a real number on our understanding of this. We imagine slaves in chains being whipped by cruel overseers building the pyramids under horrific conditions. But here is the truth. These were not slaves. They were citizens fulfilling their labor obligation to the state. And they were fed. They were housed. They were given beer rations, bread rations, sometimes even meat. Archaeological excavations at the workers' village near the pyramids at Giza show that the people building those monuments ate very well. Beef regularly. Beer 3 times a day. Better food than they probably got at home. Does that make it fair? Well, no. They were still being forced to do backbreaking labor in brutal heat. But it was not slavery in the way we understand it. It was part of the social contract, part of Ma'at. The pharaoh maintained cosmic order, kept the Nile flooding on schedule, protected Egypt from enemies. In return, you gave him a portion of your harvest and a portion of your labor. That was the deal. Then came October and everything changed. The waters would begin to recede, slowly at first, then faster, draining back into the main channel of the Nile, exposing the fields once again. And there it would be, that beautiful dark, almost black soil, still damp, still rich, ready. This was the beginning of Peré, the season of emergence, and for a farmer this was the busiest, most intense time of the entire year, because Peré was when you planted everything, October through February, 5 months of absolutely relentless work, and it started with ploughing. Now, ploughing in ancient Egypt was not like modern farming. You did not have tractors or even particularly sophisticated equipment. You had a wooden plough called an ayard, which was basically a pointed stick attached to a frame. If you were relatively well off, you owned a pair of oxen to pull that plough. If you were not, you pulled it yourself, or you borrowed oxen from someone else and paid them back later with a share of your harvest. Can you imagine pulling a plough through field after field, bent over the sun, beating down on your back, your feet, sinking into the thick mud, hour after hour, day after day? Your hands would blister, your back would scream, but you had to keep going, because if you did not get the seeds in the ground during Peret, you would not have a harvest during Shemu. And if you did not have a harvest, you could not pay your taxes. And if you could not pay your taxes, the consequences were severe. Beatings, loss of property. Your family could even be taken as labourers to work off the debt. So you ploughed. And once the field was ploughed, you planted. The whole family would be involved. You would scatter seeds by hand, walking up and down the rows. Emmer wheat mostly, some barley, maybe some flax if you had room, because flax was valuable. You could make linen from flax, and linen was what everyone wore in the eternal heat of Egypt. After the seeds were scattered, you would do something that might seem strange. You would drive your goats and sheep across the field. Their hooves would push the seeds down into the soft earth, covering them naturally. It was simple, it was effective, it worked. But planting was only the beginning of the work during Pare. Because Egyptian soil, as fertile as it was, still needed water. The flood was gone. The fields were drying out under that relentless sun, so you had to irrigate. And this is where one of the most important inventions in ancient Egyptian agriculture comes in: the shaduf. Have you ever seen a shaduf? Even if you have never heard the word, you might recognize it. It is a long wooden pole balanced on a pivot like a seesaw. On one end there is a bucket attached by a rope. On the other end there is a heavy counterweight, usually a large lump of mud or stone. You would use your body weight to pull the rope down, dipping the bucket into a canal or into the Nile itself. The bucket would fill with water. Then you would release the rope and the counterweight would swing the full bucket back up. You would guide it over to your irrigation ditch and dump the water. Then you would do it again, and again, and again. Hundreds of times, thousands of times. The shaduf was introduced around 1500 BCE during the New Kingdom, and it revolutionized farming. Suddenly you could water fields that were not right next to the river. You could extend cultivation into areas that had previously been too dry. But make no mistake, using a shaduf was brutal work, repetitive, exhausting. Your shoulders would burn, your lower back would ache. This was not romantic. This was survival. All through Pare from October to February, this was the rhythm. Plough, plant, irrigate. Watch the crops grow. Pull weeds that tried to choke out your wheat. Scare away birds that wanted to eat your seeds. Check constantly for pests. Pray to Rena Nutiet, the goddess of the harvest, that your crops would be healthy. Pray to Hapi, the god of the Nile, that the irrigation channels would flow properly. Your entire family's survival depended on those plants pushing up through the soil and growing strong. And then finally, as winter turned to spring by the modern calendar, as the days grew even hotter and drier, you would see your crops turning golden. The wheat would ripen, the barley would be ready, and you would know that Shemi was approaching, the season of harvest. March through May, the culmination of an entire year of work. Harvest time was a race against time, because if you waited too long the crops would spoil in the heat. The grain would fall from the stalks and be lost, and even worse, you were on a deadline. Because in June Akhet would begin again. The Nile would flood, and anything still in the fields when the water came would be destroyed. So every able-bodied person would be out there. Men cutting the grain with sickles, wooden blades edged with flint. Women and children following behind, gathering the cut stalks into bundles. The wheat and barley would be taken to a threshing floor, a flat area of packed earth. Then you would drive your cattle over it around and around their hooves, trampling the grain and separating the kernels from the stalks. After that came winnowing. You would take a flat basket, scoop up the mixture of grain and chaff and toss it into the air. The wind would blow away the lighter chaff and the heavier grain would fall back into the basket. It was elegant, it was efficient, and it was absolutely exhausting when you had to do it for weeks on end, processing an entire field's worth of harvest. But here is where things got really stressful, because you did not get to keep all of that grain you'd worked so hard to grow. Not even close. Tax collectors, scribes working for the pharaoh or for the local nomarch would show up at your village during Shimu. They would measure your harvest. They would calculate what you owed, and the tax rate. It could be as high as 60%. 60%. More than half of everything you had grown taken away. The scribes kept meticulous records. They knew how much land you worked. They knew what the expected yield should be. If you tried to hide grain, if you claimed your harvest was worse than it actually was, they would know. And they had the power to punish you. There are ancient papyri that describe farmers being beaten for not meeting their tax obligations, being taken away to work in labor gangs, losing their homes, and you know what is really interesting? We know so much about this because the Egyptian bureaucracy was so thorough. They wrote everything down: tax records, harvest amounts, complaints from farmers about unfair treatment, even records of strikes like the famous one at Deir el-Medina in 1156 BCE, when workers stopped work because their rations had not been delivered on time. The first recorded labour strike in human history happened in ancient Egypt, and it happened because people knew they were being treated unfairly and they had had enough. But for most farmers, most of the time you paid your taxes. You handed over your grain. It would be loaded onto donkeys or boats and taken to state granaries, massive storage facilities where the surplus would be kept. That surplus fed the cities, it fed the army, it fed the workers building temples and tombs, it fed the vast bureaucracy of priests and scribes and officials. Your labour, your sweat, your aching back and blistered hands, that was what made all of ancient Egyptian civilization possible. After the harvest was collected and the taxes were paid, you would be left with whatever remained. Hopefully enough to feed your family through the next year, enough to save some seed for the next planting during Paray, enough to maybe trade for a few necessities, some oil for cooking, maybe some fresh vegetables to supplement your diet of bread and beer. And then almost before you could catch your breath, it would be June again. The star Sirius would appear on the horizon just before dawn, a celestial signal that the Egyptians watched for every year. And within days the Nile would begin to rise once more. Akhet would return. The cycle would continue. Inundation, emergence, harvest. Inundation, emergence, harvest. Year after year after year. Generation after generation, for 3,000 years. It is hard to overstate how deeply this rhythm shaped ancient Egyptian life. Your entire sense of time, your understanding of the world was built around the Nile and its 3 seasons. You did not make plans for next summer. You made plans for next Shemu or after the flood. The river was everything. The river was time itself. And standing there in your field on this particular morning with the sun climbing higher and the work stretching out ahead of you, you would know exactly where you were in that cycle. You would know what had to be done today, this week, this season. There was no ambiguity, no uncertainty about your purpose. The land needed to be worked. The crops needed to be grown. Egypt needed to be fed. That was your job. That was your place in Ma'at. And you would do it just as your father did, just as his father did, just as your children would do after you. Because that is what it meant to be a farmer in ancient Egypt. You were not just growing food, you were maintaining the foundation of the entire civilization. You were the reason the pharaohs could build their pyramids, and the priests could serve their gods, and the scribes could record their histories. Without you, without your labour in these fields under this brutal sun, none of it would exist. The whole magnificent structure of Egyptian society rested on your shoulders, and with that weight carried with whatever dignity you could muster, you would bend back to your work. The field was waiting, the season was advancing, and there was still so much to be done before the day was through. Picture a different kind of morning in ancient Egypt. Not one spent bent over a plough or hauling water with a shadaf, but one spent sitting. Cross-legged on a cool stone floor, a wooden pallet balanced on your lap, a reed brush in your hand. The smell around you is not sweat and soil, but ink. Black ink made from soot and gum. Red ink made from that same mixture with red oxide dust added. And in front of you, spread across your workspace, is something more valuable than gold. Papyrus. Sheets of processed plant material that cost more than most people earn in a month. And you have been trusted with it. Because you are a scribe. And in ancient Egypt, that made you one of the most privileged people alive. We talked earlier about the social pyramid, about how rigid the class structure was, how your birth determined your destiny. But there was one escape hatch, one way for a poor boy to climb out of a life of manual labour and into the realm of power and respect. Literacy, the ability to read and write. And if you could master that incredibly difficult skill, if you could become a scribe, your entire life would change. Not just your life, but your children's lives, your grandchildren's lives. You would have altered your family's trajectory forever. But let me be very clear about something. Becoming a scribe was not easy. It was brutally, almost impossibly hard. And it started young. If you were going to be a scribe, your education would begin around age 6 or 7. You would be sent to a school often attached to a temple or a government office called a house of life. And there for the next 4 to 6 years, at minimum, sometimes longer, you would undergo one of the most intense educational experiences in the ancient world. Here is what you had to learn: hieroglyphics, the sacred script Medjugorje in Egyptian, which literally means words of the gods. And hieroglyphics were not simple, not even close. There were over 700 distinct characters. 700. Some were ideograms representing entire words or concepts. Some were phonograms representing sounds like our alphabet letters do. Some were determinative signs that gave you clues about what a word meant. And some characters could be used in multiple ways depending on context. You had to memorize all of them. You had to know when to use which. You had to understand the grammar, the syntax, the proper spacing and sizing of characters relative to each other. And that was just hieroglyphics, the formal script used for temple walls and monuments. For everyday work, you also had to master hieratic, which was a cursive flowing version of hieroglyphics that could be written much faster. Hieratic was what you would use for letters for tax records, for legal documents, for all the administrative work that kept Egypt functioning. And if you were learning to be a scribe during the later periods of Egyptian history, you might also need to know demotic and even more cursive script used for business and legal matters. 3 different writing systems, hundreds upon hundreds of symbols, complex grammar. And you had to learn all of this by copying, over and over and over. Your teacher would give you a text, maybe a famous piece of literature, maybe a wisdom text, collections of moral advice that had been passed down for generations. And you would sit there cross-legged on that hard floor, and you would copy it. Line by line, character by character, and when you made a mistake, when you formed a symbol incorrectly, or spaced things wrong, or used the wrong determinative, your teacher would correct it in red ink. Just like teachers do today, actually. That tradition goes back over 3,000 years. But here is where it gets rough. Education in ancient Egypt was harsh. The Egyptian word siba, which means to teach, also means to beat. Think about that. The very word for teaching implied physical punishment. Students who did not pay attention, who made too many mistakes, who talked back to their teachers, would be beaten with sticks. It was considered a normal, necessary part of education. The idea was that the knowledge was so important, so valuable, that any amount of suffering was worth it to master it. And they did not practice on papyrus at first. No way. Papyrus was far too expensive. Instead, students practiced on ostraca, broken pieces of pottery, limestone flakes. Anything flat and smooth enough to write on that did not cost precious money. Archaeologists have found thousands of these practice pieces, and some of them still have the teacher's corrections in red ink. You can almost feel the frustration of that ancient student practicing the same character over and over, trying to get it perfect. But if you survived the training, if you made it through those grueling years and passed your final examinations, your life transformed. Suddenly you were exempt from manual labor. You did not have to pay taxes. You did not have to serve in the military. You were part of the educated elite, and the demand for your skills was enormous because ancient Egypt was obsessed with record keeping. Obsessed. They wrote everything down. Tax records written and filed, court proceedings recorded in detail, grain stores inventoried and tracked, construction projects progress reports filed regularly, wills and legal contracts all documented, medical procedures, recipes for medicines, spells for protection, all written down. The amount of writing required to keep the Egyptian state functioning was staggering, and scribes were the ones who made it all happen. So what did a scribe's day actually look like? Well, that depended on where you worked. If you were a government scribe, you might spend your morning calculating taxes. Let us say you were assigned to a Noma region during harvest season. Farmers would bring in their grain to the state granaries. Your job was to measure it, record the exact amount, calculate what percentage was owed as tax document, who had paid and who had not, and keep track of any shortfalls. You would sit there with your palette on your lap, your papyrus spread in front of you, your reed pen dipped in black ink, and you would write. Column after column of hieratic script, numbers, names, amounts. All of it had to be accurate because these records would be reviewed by higher officials, maybe even by the vizier himself. Or maybe you were a temple scribe. Your work would be different. You might spend your days copying religious texts, sacred hymns to the gods, prayers and rituals that had to be performed exactly right to maintain Ma'at, books of the dead, collections of spells that wealthy people would purchase to be buried with them to guide them through the dangers of the afterlife. These texts had to be perfect. A mistake in a religious spell was not just embarrassing, it was spiritually dangerous. So you would work slowly, carefully, making sure every symbol was formed correctly, every word spelled right. Some scribes became specialists. Medical scribes would compile collections of treatments and remedies, copying from the ancient texts housed in the House of Life libraries. Legal scribes had to know the entire corpus of Egyptian law, all the precedents and procedures. Military scribes kept track of troop movements, supply chains, casualty reports. Royal scribes, the most prestigious of all, worked directly for the pharaoh, recording his decrees, managing his correspondence, documenting his great deeds for posterity. And then there were the artistic scribes, the ones with the most beautiful handwriting, because Egyptian writing was not just functional, it was art. The finest scribes developed personal styles that were genuinely calligraphic. Their hieratic script would flow across the papyrus in elegant, practiced movements. And if you were really talented, you might be commissioned to create illustrated copies of important texts. Imagine painting the Book of the Dead for a wealthy noble, decorating it with gorgeous images of gods and mythological scenes, knowing that this work would be buried with them and last for eternity. That was the pinnacle of the scribe's art. The tools of a scribe were distinctive. You would carry them everywhere, a visible mark of your status. A wooden palette, usually about a foot long, with 2 oval depressions carved into it. One for black ink, one for red. The ink itself came in solid cakes that you would wet with water from a small bowl to activate. Your pens were made from reeds, usually about 9 inches long. You would take the end and hammer it until it frayed into bristles, then trim it to make it work like a brush. Egyptian writing was painting, really. Each character was drawn with careful brush strokes. You would also carry a knife for cutting papyrus and sharpening your pens. A smooth pebble or an ivory tool for burnishing the papyrus, making its surface as smooth as possible. Maybe a piece of sandstone for erasing mistakes by scraping them away. All of these tools would fit into a leather bag or a wooden box, and you would be instantly recognizable as a scribe. People would defer to you, step aside when you walked past, because you could do something most of them could not even imagine. You could take thoughts and make them permanent. You could create records that would outlast human memory. There is a famous ancient text called the Satire of the Trades, and it is basically a propaganda piece encouraging boys to become scribes. It goes through all the other professions and describes how awful they are. The coppersmith, it says, has hands like a crocodile from working with hot metal. The potter is covered in clay like he has been wallowing in mud. The fisherman is exhausted and stinks. The farmer's back is broken from endless labour. But the scribe sits in clean linen in the shade. The scribe has the ear of powerful people. The scribe will never go hungry. And you know what, it was all true. But being a scribe was not just about comfort and prestige. It was about power. Real power. Because in a society where information was everything, where land taxes and legal contracts and royal decrees all depended on written records, the people who controlled writing controlled the system. A scribe could make someone's life very difficult if they wanted to. Record their tax payment as less than it was. Misplace a legal document. Document someone's complaint in a way that made them look bad. And on the flip side, a scribe could help people, record their payment accurately, write a letter for them to a distant official, bear witness to their contracts. There is a man named Horemheb who shows just how far a scribe could rise. He was born to middle-class parents. Nothing special. But he was trained as a scribe, and that training got him into the military administration. He became a scribe of recruits during the reign of Pharaoh Akhenaten. Then he kept getting promoted. Scribe of the army. General. By the time Tutankhamun was Pharaoh, Horemheb was the commander-in-chief of all Egyptian forces and one of the king's closest advisors, and when Tutankhamun died young without an heir who became Pharaoh Horemheb, a man born into the middle class became a god-king because he could read and write. Now I want to pause here and address something important. We have a lot of information about scribes, about their training and their work and their social status, but almost all of the scribes we know about were men. Did women become scribes? The answer is complicated. There is evidence that some women, particularly women from wealthy families, learned to read and write. There are a few women from Deir el-Medina, that workers' village we talked about earlier, who seem to have been literate. They received letters. They had labels on their storage jars. But formal training as a professional scribe seems to have been almost exclusively male. And that is a shame, because we will never know how many brilliant women were denied the opportunity to rise simply because of their gender. But for the boys who did become scribes, who survived the beatings and the endless copying and the memorization, the reward was a life that most Egyptians could only dream of. You would work in comfortable settings, often indoors. You would wear clean linen clothing. You would eat well. You would have job security because there was always more writing to be done. And perhaps most importantly, you would be remembered. Because scribes signed their work, your name would be attached to the texts you copied, the records you created. In a culture obsessed with being remembered, with leaving a mark that would last into eternity, that was no small thing. And here we are over 3,000 years later, and we know their names. We know about scribes like Amenhotep, son of Hapu, who served Pharaoh Amenhotep III and was so respected that he was deified after death. We know about the scribe Ani, whose copy of the Book of the Dead is one of the most beautiful manuscripts to survive from ancient Egypt. We know about countless others whose works fill our museums, whose writings tell us about agriculture and medicine and law and daily life in a world long gone. Every hieroglyph you see carved into a temple wall, every papyrus scroll in a museum display case, every record that tells us about tax rates or building projects or religious festivals, all of it exists because of scribes. These were the people who preserved Egyptian civilization, not just recorded it, preserved it. Without scribes, we would know almost nothing about ancient Egypt. The pyramids would still stand, but they would be mysteries. We would have no idea who built them, or why or when. The statues and temples would be beautiful but mute. It is the written word that gives them meaning, that connects us across the millennia. So as you sit there in your clean white linen, your palette on your lap, your reed pen moving carefully across precious papyrus, you're doing something profound. You're taking the ephemeral and making it permanent. You're taking the present and sending it into the future. You're building a bridge across time, and that is a kind of magic that even the gods themselves might envy. The morning light streams through the high windows of the room where you work. The air is cool, the stone floor comfortable beneath you. Outside you can hear the sounds of the city, donkeys braying, people calling to each other in the market, the distant rhythm of hammers on stone from some construction project. But in here it is quiet, focused, sacred almost. Because what you are doing is sacred. The words of the gods flowing through your hand onto the page. And when this text is complete, when you have finished copying or creating whatever document you are working on, you will carefully roll up the papyrus, seal it if necessary, and deliver it to whoever commissioned it. Then you will clean your palette, sharpen your pens, and begin the next task. Because there is always a next task. The work of keeping Egypt running never stops. And you, with your rare and valuable skills, are essential to all of it. This is the life of a scribe. And this morning, like every morning, you are grateful for it. Grateful that someone saw potential in you when you were young. Grateful that you survived the training. Grateful that you can sit here in comfort rather than labouring in the fields under the brutal sun. You are living proof that in ancient Egypt knowledge truly was power, and that power once earned could change everything. While the scribe sits in his comfortable position with ink and papyrus, while the farmer toils in fields under the climbing sun, there is another group of Egyptians whose morning looks entirely different, more mysterious, more demanding in ways that have nothing to do with physical labour or mental exertion and everything to do with absolute meticulous purity. These are the priests, and their day begins not at sunrise but well before it, in darkness, in cold water, in a ritual so precise, so exacting that a single mistake could in their minds unravel the very fabric of the universe. Let me take you inside the temple. Not as a visitor, because ordinary Egyptians were never allowed in the inner sanctum, but as a priest, someone who has been chosen, trained, and initiated into mysteries that most people will never understand. And your day, your sacred duty starts hours before anyone else is awake. It is still dark. The stars are bright overhead. Those same stars that the ancient Egyptians used to create one of the most accurate calendars in the ancient world. You wake not to an alarm but to an internal clock developed over years of this routine. And immediately before you do anything else, before you eat or drink or even fully dress, you head to the sacred lake. Every temple of any size had one. A rectangular pool of water fed by underground channels connected to the Nile, considered holy and pure. And here is where it gets intense. You have to bathe, but not just once. According to the Greek historian Herodotus, who visited Egypt in the 5th century BCE and wrote down what he saw priests bathed 4 times a day, twice during daylight hours and twice at night, 4 times, every single day. And this was not a quick rinse. This was a full ritual purification using natron, that natural salt compound we mentioned before, mixed with water. You would scrub every inch of your body. Because cleanliness was not just physical, it was spiritual. dirt was chaos, sweat was disorder, and you as a priest had to be the living embodiment of ma'at, of purity and order, before you could even think about approaching the gods. But bathing was just the beginning. After you dried off, you had to shave. Everything. And I mean everything. Head, face, eyebrows, eyelashes, arms, legs, every hair on your body had to be removed. Some sources suggest this was done every third day to keep the body completely smooth. Why? Because hair was considered a potential source of impurity. Lice and other parasites could hide in hair. Dust could cling to it. And more than that, being hairless set you apart from ordinary people. It marked you as someone who had transcended normal human concerns and entered a state of ritual perfection. Can you imagine doing this every few days in an era before modern razors or shaving cream? They used bronze blades, tweezers, pumice stones. It must have been uncomfortable at best, painful at worst. But it was non-negotiable. If you wanted to serve the gods, this is what was required. After shaving and bathing, you would rinse your mouth with a natron solution. The same salt used to preserve mummies was used to cleanse your mouth, to purify your breath before you spoke sacred words. Then you would dress, always in white linen, nothing else. No wool, no leather, no products from living animals inside the temple. White linen symbolized purity, and priests wore fresh, clean garments every day. Some priests also wore reed sandals, though many went barefoot within the temple itself to avoid bringing in any impurity from the outside world. And all of this meticulous preparation happened before the sun even rose. Because the most important ritual of the day, the one that absolutely could not be missed or delayed, was the morning awakening of the god. And it had to happen at dawn, exactly at dawn, when the first rays of light touched the horizon. Here is something most people do not understand about ancient Egyptian religion. The priests did not serve the people. They did not give sermons or provide moral guidance or offer counseling. No, the priests served the gods, only the gods, and the gods in Egyptian belief resided in their statues, not metaphorically, literally. The statue in the innermost shrine of the temple was not a representation of the god, it was the god. The deity's ka, their spirit, their essence, inhabited that carved stone or precious metal figure, and every morning that god had to be woken up, washed, dressed, and fed, just like a human being. So as dawn approaches, the high priest, freshly purified and dressed in white linen, would approach the sanctuary, the innermost chamber of the temple, a place so sacred that only the highest-ranking priests were allowed to enter. The doors would be sealed with clay and stamped with the temple's official seal. This seal would be broken every morning and remade every evening, ensuring that no one had disturbed the god during the night. The high priest would break the seal, and with prayers and incense already burning, he would slowly open the doors. Inside, in near darkness, illuminated only by the small amount of light filtering in, would be the shrine containing the god's statue. And here is where it gets ritualistic in a way that feels almost theatrical. The priest would prostrate himself, not just bow, prostrate, face to the ground, multiple times, showing absolute submission to the divine presence. Then he would recite specific prayers hymns that had been passed down for generations, maybe for centuries. These were not improvised. Every word was prescribed. Every gesture had meaning. He would say in essence, "I have come to awaken you, Great One. I have purified myself. I am pure. Wake and see the morning light." And then he would approach the shrine and open it. The statue inside might be made of gold, of bronze, of precious stone. It might be life-sized or small enough to hold in your hands. But whatever its size or material, it was treated as a living being. The priest would carefully remove the old clothing from the previous day. He would wash the statue with water from the sacred lake, sprinkle it with natron, waft incense around it. He would apply fresh rouge to its face, just a touch of red colour on the lips or cheeks to make it look vital and alive. He would dress it in new linen garments, place fresh jewellery on it, anoint it with precious oils. This whole process might take an hour or more depending on the temple and the god, and it happened every single morning without exception in every major temple across Egypt. Because if the gods were not properly cared for, if they were neglected or dishonoured, they would withdraw their favour. The Nile would not flood, crops would fail, enemies would invade, chaos would return. The stakes in the minds of the ancient Egyptians could not have been higher. After the god was awakened and prepared offerings would be presented. Food and drink, bread, beer, wine if it was a wealthy temple, cuts of meat, fruits, vegetables, honey, milk. These would be arranged on offering tables in front of the statue, not because the god would physically eat them, obviously. The Egyptians were not naive, but because the god's ka, their spiritual essence, would consume the spiritual nourishment from the offerings. The food would still be there afterward, physically intact, but it would have been transformed. Its ka would have been taken by the god. And here is the practical genius of this system. After the god had spiritually consumed the offerings, the physical food would be removed from the sanctuary and redistributed to the other priests, to temple workers. This was their payment, their daily rations. So in effect, the temple was both a religious institution and an economic one. The gods were fed first symbolically, and then the people who served the gods were fed literally. It was a redistribution system wrapped in religious ritual. But the priest's work was not done. At midday there would be another ceremony, simpler than the morning ritual but still necessary. More incense would be burned. More purifying water would be sprinkled. The temple itself, all the sacred spaces, would be consecrated again, and in the evening the whole thing would reverse. The high priest would return to the sanctuary, would close the doors of the shrine, would seal the god in for the night with prayers that essentially said, "Rest well, Great One. May you journey safely through the night." Because the Egyptians believed that at night the sun god Ra travelled through the underworld, battling the serpent of chaos, and the gods needed their rest to maintain the cosmic order. Between these major rituals, priests had other duties. They cleaned the temple constantly, sweeping floors, wiping down statues, scrubbing offering tables with natron and water. They maintained the sacred objects. They repaired anything that was damaged. They managed the temple's extensive properties, because temples owned vast amounts of land, employed thousands of people, controlled significant wealth. The high priest of Amun at Karnak during the New Kingdom was one of the richest, most powerful men in Egypt, rivaling the pharaoh himself in resources and influence. But priests also had restrictions, strict ones. During their periods of service in the temple, they could not have sexual contact. They could not eat certain foods. Some temples forbade pork, some forbade fish. Most forbade anything that was considered impure or associated with chaos. The god Set, for example, was associated with chaos, and animals sacred to Set were forbidden. Priests had to maintain an ascetic lifestyle, focused, disciplined, pure, and not all priests were full-time. Many served in rotating shifts, spending perhaps 1 month every 4 working in the temple, then returning to their normal lives. They might be farmers, craftsmen, officials during their off months. But when it was their turn to serve, they had to leave their regular lives behind and become these perfectly pure servants of the divine. There were different types of priests too. The Wab priest, the lowest rank, whose name literally means the purified ones. They did most of the cleaning and basic maintenance. The Hemnetcher, or servants of the god, who performed the daily rituals. The lector priests who were specialized in reading the sacred texts, chanting the spells and prayers that made the rituals effective. And at the top, the high priests who often came from powerful families and whose positions were sometimes hereditary. Being a high priest was not just a religious role, it was political, it was economic, it was a position of genuine power. And here is something fascinating. Women could be priests too. Priestesses served female deities like Hathor Isis and Neith. They performed rituals, played sacred instruments like the sistrum, sang hymns. Some women held the title God's Wife of Amun, a position of enormous prestige and power, especially during the late New Kingdom. These women managed vast temple estates, participated in state ceremonies, and wielded real political influence. So while Egyptian society was patriarchal in many ways, the priesthood offered some women opportunities for status and power that were rare in the ancient world. Think about what it meant to be a priest in ancient Egypt. You were not just performing empty rituals. You genuinely believed that your actions, your purity, your precise adherence to thousands of years of tradition were maintaining the cosmic order. The sun rose every morning because you awakened the gods. The Nile flooded every year because you kept the gods satisfied. Egypt prospered because you were doing your job correctly. That is an enormous psychological burden, but also an enormous source of meaning. Your life had purpose on the most fundamental level imaginable. And standing there in the cool shadows of the temple, smelling the incense and hearing the distant sounds of the waking city outside, you would know that you were part of something bigger than yourself, part of an ancient tradition connecting you to generations of priests going back to the very beginning of Egyptian civilization, part of the delicate mechanism that kept chaos at bay and allowed order to prevail. You were not just a servant. You were essential. You were the link between humanity and the divine. The morning rituals complete, the god awakened and fed you might finally have a few hours to yourself. Time to eat your share of the offerings. Time to rest in the temple courtyards, maybe play a game of Senate with the other priests. Time to study sacred texts, to copy religious manuscripts, to teach younger initiates. But always, always you are aware that the evening ritual is coming, that the cycle never stops, that tomorrow you will wake again before dawn, descend again into that cold sacred lake, purify yourself again, and perform these same rituals all over again. Because in ancient Egypt the priests never had a day off from maintaining the universe, and as the sun climbs higher toward midday, as the heat intensifies, and the world outside the temple walls grows busy with commerce and labor and the endless activity of human civilization inside these sacred spaces, everything remains focused on one single purpose: keeping the gods happy, keeping Mayat intact, keeping Egypt and by extension the entire world from sliding back into primordial chaos. It is a heavy responsibility. But someone has to carry it. And that someone today and every day is you. The sun is directly overhead now, high noon in Egypt, and if you have ever experienced truly oppressive heat, the kind that makes you question every life decision that brought you to this moment, you have some idea of what midday feels like in the Nile Valley, except there is no air conditioning, no electric fans, no refrigeration. The temperature is climbing past 40 degrees Celsius over 104 Fahrenheit, and the day is only half finished. This is the hour when the whole rhythm of Egyptian life shifts, when work slows, when smart people seek shade, when the marketplace comes alive with voices haggling and arguing over the fairest way to exchange goods without a single coin changing hands. Because here is something fascinating about ancient Egypt. For most of its 3,000-year history, they had no money, no coins, no currency, nothing you could put in a pocket and use to buy things. And yet they had one of the most sophisticated economies in the ancient world. They had massive construction projects, international trade networks, a thriving merchant class. How does a civilization function without money? The answer is more interesting than you might think. Let me take you to the marketplace. In a larger city like Thebes or Memphis, the market operated every day. In smaller towns and villages, it might be once a week, or only on special festival days when people from different villages would gather together. The Egyptian word for marketplace was probably related to merit, which means riverbank, which makes sense. The Nile was Egypt's highway, and most marketplaces were located near the river where boats could easily dock and unload their goods. Picture a wide open space shaded by reed awnings stretched on wooden poles. Because remember, in this heat shade is not a luxury, it is a necessity. It is survival. The marketplace is noisy, chaotic in the best possible way. Merchants sitting beside rush baskets full of fish pulled fresh from the Nile that morning. Others with pottery arranged on woven mats, each piece valued not just for its weight, but for its usefulness, its artistry. There are vegetables, onions and lettuces and cucumbers laid out in neat piles. There are cuts of meat, expensive and rare drawing flies in the heat. There are bolts of linen cloth. Because linen was valuable, linen was everywhere in Egyptian life, and linen could be traded for almost anything. And over in one corner there is someone selling amulets and spell scrolls, because even shopping had a spiritual component in ancient Egypt. And every single person in this market is engaged in barter, direct exchange of goods and services, but not random chaotic barter. That would never work. The Egyptians had developed a system, a sophisticated one, to make sure trades were fair. They used something called the Deir. Now the Deir was not a coin. This is crucial to understand. It was a unit of weight, about 91 grams, a little over 3 ounces, typically measured in copper. Think of it like a price tag. Like when you see something costs $20, except instead of dollars, Egyptians would say this pot costs 2. Dibn, this pair of sandals costs 1 dubn, this cow costs 140 dubn. The dubn told you the value of something. It gave everyone a common reference point, but you did not actually pay in dubn weights. You paid in other goods that were worth that same value. So imagine you are a farmer. You have just brought your surplus grain to the market. You want a new pair of sandals because yours are falling apart. The sandal maker tells you his sandals are worth 1 dibn. Your grain is also valued at 1 dibn per bag. Simple. You trade 1 bag of grain for 1 pair of sandals. Done. Fair. Both parties happy. But what if the values do not match perfectly? What if you want something worth 3 dibn but you only have goods worth 2 dibn? This is where it gets creative. You make change. You add something else. A jug of beer, a handful of dates, a small clay lamp, whatever you have that brings the total value up to 3 dibn. And the brilliant part is almost anything could be used in trade. Grain, linen, oil, fish, pottery, tools, furniture, even labour. Your work had a dibn value too. A simple labourer might earn 5.5 sacks of grain per month, while a foreman earned 7.5. That grain could then be traded for everything else you needed. This system worked because prices were relatively stable and well known. Everyone knew roughly what things cost. A linen shirt was worth 5 dibn of copper. A cow was worth 140 dibn. There were even records, written lists of standard prices so that disputes could be settled. And for big purchases, expensive things, all trades had to be done in public with witnesses present. The merchants would swear in front of these witnesses that the goods were in good condition, that everything was legitimate. Over time, this evolved into written contracts, legal documents that outlined the exchange. The ancient Egyptians were meticulous record keepers, and they did not trust anything important to memory alone. What I find fascinating here is how this system encouraged honesty. You could not just scam someone and disappear. Everyone knew everyone, especially in smaller communities. Your reputation mattered. If you cheated someone, word would spread, and good luck ever trading successfully again. There was social pressure to be fair, to honour your agreements, to maintain mart in your business dealings, just as much as in your spiritual life. And while this bartering is happening, while the marketplace is full of noise and movement, and the smell of fish and fresh bread and human sweat, people are also socializing. Because the market is not just about commerce, it is about community. This is where you hear news, where you learn what is happening in neighbouring villages, where marriages are arranged and disputes are aired, and friendships are renewed. Women particularly were active in the marketplace. They could own property in ancient Egypt, could engage in trade, could manage their own business affairs. You would see women selling surplus produce from their household gardens, trading textiles. They had woven negotiating prices with the same skill and determination as any man. But as the sun climbs higher, as noon passes and the heat becomes truly unbearable, something happens. The market slows. People start to withdraw, because there is a limit to what the human body can endure, and ancient Egyptians were not foolish enough to ignore that limit. This is when you see the genius of Egyptian architecture. Even the simplest houses were designed with heat management in mind. Those thick mud brick walls we mentioned at the beginning, they were not just for structure. Mud brick has what is called thermal mass. It absorbs heat during the day, very slowly keeping the interior cool, and then releases that heat at night when the outside air is cooler. It is passive climate control and it works beautifully. The houses also had small high windows just below the ceiling. These let light in but kept direct sun out, and more importantly they let hot air escape. Hot air rises, so those high windows functioned like vents, allowing the hottest air to leave, while cooler air entered through the doorways. Wealthy people had courtyards, open spaces in the centre of their homes, sometimes with small gardens, always with some form of shade. These courtyards acted like cooling engines. At night, when the air was cool, the courtyard doors would be left open, and cool air would sink into the courtyard and flow into the surrounding rooms. During the day, with the doors closed, the courtyard stayed shaded and relatively cool, a little oasis in the middle of the house. It was brilliant design, all achieved without any technology, beyond clever use of space and materials. And during these hottest hours, people would rest. The ancient world understood something we have forgotten in our 24-hour always working culture. They understood that sometimes the smart thing to do is nothing. In modern Egypt, this tradition continues as the afternoon rest, similar to the siesta in Mediterranean countries. You work in the morning when it's cooler, you rest during the midday heat. You resume work in the late afternoon when temperatures drop. It is not laziness, it is adaptation, it is intelligence. Those who could afford it would retreat to the coolest rooms in their homes. They would drink water kept cool in clay jars. These jars, called Deir, were large porous clay vessels. Water would seep very slowly through the clay, and as it evaporated on the outside surface, it would cool the water inside. Same principle as sweating, evaporative cooling. No electricity required. Some people would even pour water on their clay floors to cool the room through evaporation. Or they would hang damp linen cloths in doorways, and as air passed through the damp fabric, it would cool by a few precious degrees. But not everyone could rest. Farmers still had to tend their irrigation channels. Priests still had their midday rituals in the temples. Workers on construction projects might keep going, though even then there is evidence that work would pause during the absolute worst heat. Water was provided, breaks were given, because a dead worker is no good to anyone. And as the afternoon wears on, as the shadows start to lengthen just slightly, the marketplace begins to come alive again. People emerge from their homes. The volume of voices increases. More haggling, more trading. Someone is arguing about the quality of a fish. Someone else is insisting that their pottery is worth more than 2 because look at the intricate design, look at the craftsmanship. A priest still in his white linen is trading temple rations for personal items. Because yes, even priests participated in the market economy. They received their food from the temple offerings, but they still needed tools, clothing, household goods, and they traded for those like everyone else. You might see workers from Deir el-Medina, the artisan village, bringing finished goods to trade. Small statues they carved in their free time, pieces of furniture, tools. These skilled craftsmen were paid in rations by the state, but they could supplement their income by creating things to trade privately. There were no laws against that. In fact, it was encouraged. Personal enterprise, even in a state-controlled economy, was part of the system. And somewhere in all this bustle and heat and commerce, in this complex dance of value and exchange happening without a single coin, you can see something profound. You can see a civilization that functioned on trust, on shared understanding of value, on the social fabric that held people together. Money makes things easier in many ways, sure, but it also makes things impersonal, anonymous. When you trade a bag of your grain for someone else's sandals, when you look them in the eye and agree that this exchange is fair, when your reputation in the community depends on honoring your agreements, there is human connection there. There is accountability. There is something fundamentally social about barter that cash transactions can lose. Of course, it was not perfect. There were disputes. There were people who tried to cheat the system. We have legal records, papyrus documents detailing court cases over trade disagreements. But the fact that these records exist proves that the Egyptians took this seriously. They had mechanisms to resolve disputes. They had standards and expectations. They had once again Ma'at, the principle of justice and fairness that was supposed to govern all aspects of life. As the sun finally begins its descent toward the western horizon, as the brutal midday heat starts to ease into merely uncomfortable warmth, you can feel the city exhale. People have survived another day. The market is winding down. Goods have changed hands. Deals have been struck. Bellies will be full tonight. And yes, there will be complaints. The fish seller overcharged. The potter was stubborn. The grain was not as good as promised. But these are the complaints of a functioning society. The complaints of people who expect fairness and notice when they do not get it. This is daily life in ancient Egypt at its most visible, at its most human. Not in the grand temples or the royal palaces, but here in the dust and heat and noise of the marketplace, where value is negotiated face to face, where social bonds are strengthened through exchange, where survival is a communal effort, not an individual one. And as the afternoon progresses, as people head home with their traded goods, as children run through the narrow streets playing games, we will talk about soon. The day is far from over. Because evening is coming, dinner needs to be prepared, families will gather, the sun will paint the sky in shades of gold and red, and the ancient Egyptians, like people everywhere throughout history, will turn their attention to the things that matter most, to family, to rest, to the simple pleasures that make life worth living regardless of what century you happen to be born in. There is a particular kind of quiet that settles over a workshop, not silence exactly, but a focused hush broken only by the specific sounds of work. The tap, tap, tap of a mallet against a chisel, the rhythmic scrape of an adze shaping wood, the whisper of a brush applying paint to plaster, and in ancient Egypt in workshops scattered throughout the cities and villages in specialized communities like the famous Deir el-Medina. This quiet, creative labor was happening every single day. Men were transforming raw materials into objects of such beauty, such precision, such spiritual significance, that 3,000 years later we still stand in museums and wonder how they possibly did it. Let me take you into one of these workshops. Not the idealized, spotlessly clean version you might see painted on tomb walls, where everything is orderly and perfect and designed to look good for eternity. Number 1. I want you to see the real thing. The hot, noisy, dusty reality of artistic creation in the ancient world. The workshop is probably attached to a temple or a palace. Most artisans worked for the state, for religious institutions, or for wealthy nobles. Independent craftsmen existed, sure, making things to trade in the marketplace. But the truly skilled artisans, the ones creating masterpieces, were employed by those with resources, and they worked not alone in romantic isolation like a modern artist, but in teams. Large groups organized by specialty, overseen by foremen, supplied with materials by the government. Their tools literally weighed before and after each shift to prevent theft. Because yes, even bronze chisels were valuable enough to steal. The workshop floor is covered in debris, chips of stone, curls of wood shavings, splashes of spilled paint, broken pottery shards used as practice surfaces or notepads. It is hot, stifling hot, because many processes require fire, kilns for pottery, furnaces for metalwork, the air thick with smoke and dust and the smell of sweat and hot metal. Nothing glamorous about it. This is manual labor, skilled manual labor, but still physically demanding work that left men exhausted at the end of the day. And yet what they created, what emerged from this chaos. Gold jewelry so delicate it looks like it might float. Stone statues carved with such precision that you can see individual muscles beneath the skin. Wooden furniture inlaid with ivory and ebony, assembled with joints so perfect they held together for millennia without nails. Pottery painted with scenes so detailed you can identify individual plant species. Glass beads in colours we still cannot quite replicate. These men, these anonymous artisans whose names we mostly do not know, were masters of their crafts in ways that put many modern artisans to shame. Let me tell you about the tools, because tools tell you everything about a culture's capabilities. For woodworking, the most important tool was the adze. It looks like an axe, except the blade is perpendicular to the handle instead of parallel. You would swing it in a pulling motion toward your body, using it to shape and smooth wood. Dangerous if you were careless, incredibly effective if you knew what you were doing. They also had saws, but here is something interesting. Egyptian saws cut only on the pull stroke, not the push stroke, so the motion, the entire technique was different from modern sawing. You would hold the wood upright, often tied to a post, and pull the saw toward you again and again. Exhausting work. Your shoulders would burn, but it got the job done. For finer work they had chisels of various sizes, made of copper initially, later bronze. Not as hard as steel, obviously, but hard enough when you knew how to use them. And they did know. They would use these bronze chisels to carve limestone, sandstone, even granite. For the really hard stones like granite, they would use a technique involving copper tools and abrasive sand. You would sprinkle the sand, then work the copper back and forth, and it was actually the sand doing the cutting, not the copper itself. Slow, tedious, but it worked. Those massive statues, those towering obelisks, were shaped one tiny bit at a time by men with copper tools and infinite patience. Stonemasons would sit on simple three-legged stools, the kind that showed up in every workshop scene painted on tomb walls. These stools were characteristic of artisan life, practical, portable, stable on uneven floors. The stone they worked on would rest on blocks with ledges to prevent it from slipping, and they would work for hours tapping away with their mallets and chisels, their hands developing calluses on top of calluses, their muscles aching, their eyes straining in whatever light was available. Because workshops did not have great lighting. Small windows, maybe some lamps, but mostly you worked in dimness, relying on feel as much as sight. Carpenters faced a different challenge. Wood was scarce in Egypt. They had acacia, which grew locally, but it was not great for large projects. For quality wood for cedar that was strong and durable and beautiful, they had to import it from Lebanon, which meant wood was expensive, which meant you did not waste it. Every cut had to be precise, every joint had to fit perfectly, and Egyptian carpenters developed sophisticated joinery techniques. They used mortise and tenon joints, dovetails, mitered corners, dowels, the same methods essentially that carpenters use today. They would assemble furniture coffins, shrine boxes, all without metal fasteners, just wood fitting perfectly into wood held together by expert craftsmanship and sometimes animal glue. And the jewelers, oh the jewelers. These men worked with gold, with silver when it was available, with semi-precious stones like lapis lazuli brought from Afghanistan, turquoise from Sinai, carnelian from the desert. They used techniques like cloisonné, where you solder thin strips of gold onto a base to create compartments, then fill those compartments with coloured glass or stone. They used granulation, attaching tiny spheres of gold to a surface to create texture and pattern. They used the lost wax casting method for complex shapes. You would carve a model in wax, cover it in clay, heat it, so the wax melts and drains out, then pour molten metal into the void. When the clay breaks away, you have a perfect metal copy of your original wax design. Brilliant! And they were doing this 3,000 years ago. Every material required different knowledge, different skills. Potters working on wheels, spinning the clay with one hand while shaping it with the other, feeling the exact pressure needed to thin a wall or create a curve. They would fire their pottery in kilns that had to reach specific temperatures regulated by experience and instinct, not thermometers. Too hot and the pot would crack. Too cool and it would be weak, porous, useless. Glass makers melting silica sand with natron to create glass, then adding metal oxides for colour. Copper for blue and green, cobalt for deep blue, manganese for purple. Chemistry without chemistry learned through generations of trial and error. And all of this work happened under pressure. Not just the physical demands, but the psychological ones. Because in many workshops, especially those working on royal projects, there was intense oversight. Scribes kept records of everything. Every tool checked out and checked back in. Every material weighed and recorded. Why, because theft was common. Materials were valuable. A worker could easily pocket some gold shavings, some silver, some precious stone. So tools were weighed at the end of each day to make sure no metal had been filed off and hidden. Suspicious, absolutely, but probably necessary. There was also the foreman, the overseer, who held enormous responsibility and power. He managed the workflow. He dealt with complaints. He made sure projects stayed on schedule. And according to records from Deir el-Medina, some foremen abused this power. There are documented cases of foremen stealing, taking bribes, showing favoritism. One famous case involved a foreman named Peneb, accused of looting royal tombs adultery and causing unrest in the entire community. We do not know how his case ended, but records suggest someone in authority was executed around that time. Justice in ancient Egypt was serious business. But let me tell you about the positive side too. Because despite the oversight and the pressure and the physical demands, there was real pride in this work. Artisans knew they were creating things for eternity. The temples they decorated would stand for thousands of years. The tombs they carved would preserve the dead for the afterlife. The jewelry they crafted would adorn kings, and queens would be treasured, would connect the living to the divine. There was spiritual significance in every chisel mark, every painted hieroglyph, every polished surface. And in villages like Deir el-Medina, artisans lived relatively comfortable lives. They were state employees paid regular wages in grain and beer and other goods. They had housing provided. They had servants to help with domestic tasks like grinding grain and carrying water. They worked 8-day weeks with 2 days off. 2 days. For rest, for worship, for working on their own tombs, because yes, even the artisans who spent their days creating tombs for kings were also preparing their own tombs, decorating them with the same skills, the same care, just on a smaller scale. These communities had their own chapels, their own social structures, their own legal systems. The workers at Deir el-Medina actually organized the first recorded labor strike in history. During the reign of Ramses III, around 1155 BCE, when their grain rations were late, the workers stopped work. They marched to nearby temples. They demanded their pay. They refused to return until they got what they were owed. And it worked. They got their rations. This system, for all its power imbalances, could still be pressured. Workers had some agency, some collective power when they chose to use it. Apprenticeship in these crafts typically started young, often by following your father or uncle into the family trade. A boy might start at age 7 or 8 watching learning doing simple tasks. Gradually he would be allowed to try more complex work. He would practice on cheap materials on limestone sherds, called ostraca, on broken pottery. These practice pieces survive today, thousands of them, and they are fascinating. You can see the progression of skill. You can see mistakes corrected in red ink by a master. You can see the same design attempted multiple times as a young artisan tried to get it exactly right. And here is something that often gets forgotten. Not all artisans were men. Women could weave, obviously, that was considered women's work. But women also brewed beer, commercially made pottery, created textiles that were highly valued trade goods. In Deir el-Medina, some women were literate. They could read and write. They participated in religious ceremonies. They managed households and raised children while their husbands spent days or weeks away at the Valley of the Kings chiseling tombs into bedrock. The whole community functioned because of both skilled labor and the domestic work that supported it. You cannot separate the two. One artisan whose name we do know is Sennacherib, a workman from Deir el-Medina who lived during the reign of Seti I and Ramses II. His tomb was discovered intact, and it is extraordinary. The walls are covered in vibrant paintings, scenes from the Book of the Dead, images of him and his wife in the afterlife, agricultural scenes in the field of reeds. The colours are still bright after more than 3,000 years. Yellows and reds and blues and greens that pop off the walls like they were painted yesterday. This man, this craftsman who spent his days working on royal tombs, put the same devotion, the same skill, the same attention to detail into his own final resting place. And it shows. It absolutely shows. The work of these artisans, their collective output over centuries, is what defines ancient Egyptian civilization in the popular imagination. The golden mask of Tutankhamun, created by anonymous goldsmiths whose names are lost. The intricate wall carvings at Karnak anonymous stonemasons. The delicate glass jewellery, the inlaid furniture, the painted papyrus scrolls, all created by craftsmen who laboured in hot, dusty workshops, whose hands were rough with calluses, whose backs ached at the end of the day, but whose skills were extraordinary. They did not sign their work. They were not credited individually except in rare cases. The society that employed them, the scribble class that recorded everything else, often looked down on manual labourers, even skilled ones. There is a text from the Middle Kingdom written by a scribe that mocks craftsmen. It describes the metalworker as stinking worse than fish, his fingers like crocodile hide. It describes the woodcarver as working longer hours than a farmer exhausted, never free. Condescending, dismissive, the arrogance of the educated class toward those who worked with their hands. But fortunately, we do not have to rely on those snobbish scribes for our opinion of Egyptian craftsmanship. We can see the work itself, and the work speaks louder than any text ever could. These men and some women, these artisans who were considered socially inferior to scribes and priests, created objects of such beauty, such precision, such lasting power, that museums around the world display them as treasures. Children press their faces to glass cases to stare at golden necklaces. Scholars spend careers studying a single painted tomb. Engineers still debate exactly how certain joints were achieved. The work endures. The names may be lost, but the legacy is immortal. As the afternoon wears on, as the light shifts and the workshop begins to cool slightly, the artisans continue their work. Focused, methodical, each contributing their piece to something larger than themselves. A temple that will inspire awe, a statue that will embody a god, a coffin that will protect someone's journey to the afterlife. They're not just making objects, they are participating in the great cosmic order in Mayat through their skills. They're creating beauty and meaning and permanence in a world that, like all worlds, is temporary and uncertain. The hammering continues, the sawing continues, the painting continues. And somewhere far from this workshop, children are playing in the streets, their laughter echoing off mud brick walls, their games ancient even by Egyptian standards, their joy uncomplicated and pure. Which is exactly where we are headed next. Children are laughing. Somewhere in every Egyptian village, in every town, in the narrow streets between mud brick houses, children are playing, running, shouting, arguing over rules, making up games, and you know what strikes me as remarkable? Some of the games those Egyptian children were playing 5,000 years ago are games children still play today. Tag, leapfrog, tug of war. The same impulse toward play, toward competition, toward joy transcends culture and time. Because human nature at its core does not change very much. But the ancient Egyptians did not just play. They turned play into an art form. They created some of the world's oldest and most sophisticated board games. They developed athletic competitions that were integral to religious festivals and military training. They made toys that were surprisingly complex for their era. And they understood something important, something we sometimes forget in our productivity-obsessed modern world. They understood that life was not just about work. It was also about rest, about pleasure, about spending time with people you love, doing things that have no purpose beyond the doing itself. Let me tell you about Senet. Because if there is one game that defines ancient Egypt in the popular imagination, it is this one. Senet means passing, and it was played on a board of 30 squares arranged in 3 rows of 10. The exact rules have been lost, which frustrates archaeologists and game historians to no end, but we know the basic structure. 2 players each with several game pieces would race their pieces across the board in a reverse S-shaped path. You would throw knuckle bones or throw sticks, essentially ancient dice, to determine how many spaces you could move. And the last 5 squares on the board were special. They had symbols carved into them. One had a simple stroke, another had 2 strokes, then 3, then a diagonal cross, then a circle with a cross. These were hazard squares, trap squares, something that made the endgame tense and unpredictable. Now Senet started out as just a game, pure entertainment. But over time, something fascinating happened. It became religious. By the New Kingdom around 1500 BCE, Senet, had transformed into something more than recreation. It became a metaphor for the journey of the soul through the afterlife. Those special squares at the end of the board, they represented stages of the journey toward eternal life. Playing senet became a ritual act, a way to symbolically experience and prepare for death, which is why 4 senet boards were found in Tutankhamun's tomb. The boy king needed something to do in the afterlife, sure. But more than that, the game itself was a magical aid, a tool for navigating the dangers of the underworld. Chapter 17 of the Book of the Dead literally depicts the deceased playing senet against an invisible opponent, presumably a deity or one's own fate. Winning the game meant successfully passing into the blessed afterlife. Losing meant, well, not making it. So every time you sat down to play senet, you were not just moving pieces on a board. You were rehearsing your own death and resurrection. You were engaging with cosmic forces. You are participating in Ma'at, the ordering of chaos into meaning. That is a lot of weight to put on a board game. But it shows you how the Egyptians blurred the line between the sacred and the secular, between work and play, between this life and the next. And senet was everywhere. Wealthy people had boards made of ebony and ivory inlaid with precious materials beautiful enough to be art pieces. Poor people scratched boards into the dirt and used pebbles as game pieces. Everyone played. Tomb paintings show queens playing senet. Nefertari, the wife of Ramses II, is depicted playing her expression focused and serene. Workers at Deir el-Medina played during their leisure time. Children learned the game young. It was the universal pastime spanning all social classes, uniting everyone in this shared experience. But senet was not the only game. There was mehen, the game of the snake played on a circular board with a coiled serpent design. The board itself was the snake, and you moved game pieces shaped like lions and lionesses, along with small marble-like balls toward the centre. We think the goal was to reach the centre first to symbolically join the sun god Ra on his journey through the night, but again the exact rules are lost. What we do know is that mehen dated back to the very earliest periods of Egyptian civilization, around 3000 BCE, and then mysteriously disappeared after the Old Kingdom. Nobody knows why. Fashion changed, maybe. New games became popular, or perhaps the religious significance shifted, and the game lost its relevance. There was also a game called Hounds and Jackals played on a board with 58 holes using pegs topped with dog and jackal heads. We have even less idea how this one worked, but it was found across Egypt and the Near East, suggesting it was popular and maybe even traded internationally. Board games were serious business in the ancient world. But children cared less about cosmic significance and more about having fun. And Egyptian children had plenty of toys. Archaeologists have found dolls made of linen stuffed with papyrus reeds, wooden animals with moving parts, a hippo with a jaw that opens and closes, a crocodile with a movable mouth, a mouse with a tail that moves when you pull a string. These are not crude toys. These are sophisticated mechanical creations that required real craftsmanship. Someone's father or grandfather sitting in a workshop after a long day's work carved these toys for children, put time and love and skill into making something that served no purpose except to bring joy to a kid. That moves me honestly, it really does. Children also played with balls made of leather or woven papyrus stuffed with horsehair or straw. These were used for juggling, for throwing games, for early versions of handball. They had spinning tops, usually cone-shaped, with decorated tops that would spin beautifully when you launched them with a quick twist. They had rattles for babies. They had miniature weapons for boys pretending to be soldiers. They had jump ropes. They played hopscotch. They played leapfrog. They ran races. They wrestled. And here is something important. Boys and girls did not play together. The games were segregated by gender, reflecting the broader social values of the culture. boys played games that emphasized physical strength and combat skills. Wrestling, boxing, javelin throwing, team sports like an early form of field hockey using curved palm branches and leather balls stuffed with papyrus. These games trained boys for military service, for manual labor, for the physical demands of adult life. Girls played games that emphasized grace and coordination, gymnastics, gymnastic dance, juggling, catch with balls. These skills, this focus on movement and rhythm, prepared girls for the dancing and ceremonial roles they would play as women in religious festivals and social gatherings. Both boys and girls learned to swim very young, which makes sense. Egypt was defined by the Nile. Water was everywhere. Canals, irrigation channels, the great river itself. If you could not swim, you were in danger every single day. So children learned. And once they learned, they turned swimming into play. They had competitions. They raced. They played games in the water that look remarkably similar to games children play in pools today. Diving contests, splashing battles, naval mock battles where two teams in small boats would try to knock each other into the water. Physical comedy, essentially. Slapstick performed on the Nile. For adults, sports were equally important but carried greater significance. Physical fitness was valued across all social classes. The pharaoh himself was expected to be athletic. During the Hebsed festival held after the first 30 years of a king's reign, the pharaoh had to run a ritual course to prove he was still physically capable of ruling. If he could not, it raised serious questions about his fitness for kingship. Ramses II was known as an excellent archer and hunter who maintained his physical strength well into old age. Amenhotep II could supposedly shoot an arrow through a thick copper target while riding in a moving chariot. Whether that story is true or exaggerated does not really matter. What matters is that physical prowess was part of the royal image, part of what made a pharaoh legitimate. Wrestling was probably the most popular sport. Tomb paintings from Beni Hasan dating to around 2000 BCE show wrestlers in various holds and positions that look exactly like modern wrestling techniques. Leg sweeps, arm bars, grappling moves. The same physics, the same leverage points have worked for 5,000 years. These matches were spectator events. People gathered to watch. There were referees to ensure fair play and enforce rules. Sometimes wrestlers wore uniforms or identifying markers. This was organized sport, not just spontaneous roughhousing. Boxing was equally popular, though probably more dangerous. No padded gloves, no protective gear. Just two men bare-fisted swinging at each other until someone gave up or got knocked down. It was brutal. It was exciting. People loved it. Women's gymnastic dance competitions were also popular spectator events, with men watching in the same way they might watch sports today. The famous Westcar papyrus tells a story about King Sneferu, who was feeling depressed, and his chief scribe suggested he go boating on the lake with the most beautiful women from the palace. The women would row and entertain him with their grace and movement. The story is playful and light, suggesting that watching attractive women perform physical activities was considered perfectly acceptable entertainment. But entertainment in ancient Egypt was not just games and sports. Music and dance were absolutely central to their culture. Every festival, every celebration, every banquet, every religious ceremony involved music. They had harps, some quite large, that produced deep resonant tones. They had flutes made of reed. They had drums and tambourines and cymbals and clappers. They had lute stringed instruments played with picks or fingers. The sounds they created we can only imagine. No recordings exist, obviously, but tomb paintings show musicians playing with concentration and joy, suggesting this was serious art, not just background noise. dancing was everywhere. At religious festivals, trained dancers would perform choreographed routines in temples as offerings to the gods. At private banquets, professional dancers and acrobats would entertain wealthy guests. At family gatherings, everyone would dance, though men danced with men and women with women. There was no mixed dancing between genders in formal settings. The movements we see in tomb paintings are graceful, athletic, sometimes acrobatic, backbends, leaps, complex footwork. This required training and skill. Professional dancers were respected members of society employed by temples and wealthy households. And then there were the festivals. Oh, the festivals. Ancient Egypt loved a good party. The Opet festival in Thebes lasted weeks and involved processions, music, dancing, athletic competitions, rowing contests, wrestling matches, feasting, drinking. The whole city shut down to celebrate. The gods Amunmut and Khonsu would travel in elaborate barks carried on the shoulders of priests from Karnak to Luxor Temple, and along the way everyone celebrated. It was public communal unifying. Rich and poor alike participated. For a brief time, normal hierarchies softened. Everyone could eat and drink and watch the entertainment and feel part of something larger than themselves. Storytelling was another crucial form of entertainment. Most people could not read remember. No theatre existed until the Greek period. So oral storytelling carried the culture. Epic tales of gods and pharaohs, adventure stories like the tale of Sinew about an Egyptian official who fled to Syria and had adventures before returning home, ghost stories, love poetry, bawdy jokes, magical tales. These were told around fires at night, performed by skilled storytellers who could hold an audience spellbound for hours. This oral tradition preserved history, taught moral lessons, entertained and bound communities together through shared narratives. What I find beautiful about all of this, about the games and sports and music and dance and storytelling, is how it reveals the full humanity of ancient Egypt. It is easy to think of these people as distant alien obsessed with death and the afterlife. But look at them playing senet. Look at children laughing as they play with mechanical toys. Look at wrestlers grappling in the dust. Look at dancers spinning to the beat of drums. Look at families gathered around a storyteller under the stars. These are people who understood joy, who valued leisure, who knew that a life well lived was not just about work and duty and preparing for death. It was also about living fully in the present moment. And as the sun continues its descent toward the western horizon, as the day's heat finally begins to break, these games wind down. Children head home dusty and tired and happy. Adults finish their final matches, their final dances. The laughter fades to a comfortable quiet, because soon it will be time for the most important gathering of the day. Time to come together as family. Time to eat the evening meal. Time to share the stories of the day. Time to connect with the people who matter most in the small, intimate space of home. Home. After all the work, all the heat, all the commerce and competition and play, everything ultimately leads back here, to the small mud brick house at the end of a dusty street, to the people waiting inside, to the relationships that matter more than anything else in the world. Because for all the grandeur of temples and pyramids, for all the complexity of Egyptian religion and government, the real heart of this civilization was always the family. The simple, profound human connections that transcend time and culture and speak to something universal in all of us. Marriage in ancient Egypt was at its core practical. The word for marriage, gukpa, literally means to found a house. Not to find true love, not to unite souls, to found a house, to create a household, to establish an economic and social unit that would produce children, maintain property and function as a productive part of the community. Very pragmatic, very practical. And yet woven through all that practicality was something beautiful. Because the Egyptians also believed that marriage would continue into the afterlife, that the person you chose as your spouse would be with you for eternity, which meant you better choose wisely. Nobody wanted to be miserably married forever. So how did marriages happen? There was no wedding ceremony, at least not in the formal religious sense we might recognize today. No priest performing sacred rites. No vows spoken before a deity. Marriage was a civil matter, a social arrangement. A young man, usually between 16 and 20 years old, would approach the family of a girl, usually around 13 or 14, sometimes younger, and negotiations would begin. The girl's father would be the primary decision-maker, though in later periods women had more say in choosing their husbands. The groom would often give a gift to the bride's family and then gifts to the bride herself. And once both families agreed, once arrangements about property and wealth were settled, the couple would simply move in together. That was it. That was marriage, living together, founding a house. But, and this is crucial, there were contracts, written agreements that specified exactly what each person brought into the marriage and what would happen if things went wrong. Because property rights mattered enormously in ancient Egypt, and women had rights that would shock people in many later civilizations. A woman kept full control of any property she brought into the marriage. Her dowry, her inherited land, her possessions all remained legally hers, and any property acquired during the marriage was joint property, typically split 2/3 to the husband and 1/3 to the wife. These were not suggestions. These were legal standards enforced by courts if necessary. And divorce, surprisingly straightforward. Either party could initiate it. A woman unhappy with her husband could go to court, present her case, and if the court agreed the marriage should end, she walked away with everything she brought in, plus her share of the joint property, plus often custody of the children, plus sometimes ongoing financial support from her ex-husband. Meanwhile, if a husband initiated divorce, he typically had to pay a penalty and still forfeited his share of joint property. The system was designed to protect women financially, recognizing that they were generally the economically vulnerable party. This was radical for the ancient world. Women in Mesopotamia, in Greece, in Rome had far fewer rights. But Egyptian women could own property-run businesses, initiate legal proceedings, and divorce abusive or incompatible husbands. They were called NBTPR, the Lady of the House, and that title meant something real. Now, did people marry for love? Sometimes, yes. Love poetry from ancient Egypt survives, and it is beautiful and passionate, and proves that romantic love was absolutely valued. Young people wrote poems comparing their beloved to flowers, to honey, to the sweetest things they knew. They described longing and desire and the joy of being together. And older couples, those who'd been married for years, demonstrated genuine affection in tomb paintings. Husbands and wives are depicted embracing, standing close together, their body language showing comfort and familiarity. Spouses often called each other brother and sister, terms of endearment that suggested equality and closeness. They were partners, companions, not master and servant. But love, romantic love, was not required for marriage to be successful. What was required was mutual respect, compatible temperaments, and a shared commitment to making the household function. Men were expected to provide for their wives to ensure their happiness and comfort. Women were expected to manage the household efficiently, to raise well-mannered children, to keep themselves neat and groomed, and to be content. Both parties had clear roles and responsibilities, and when both fulfilled their roles, the marriage could be happy, even if passion was absent. Contentment was valued, stability was valued, partnership was valued, children were treasured, absolutely treasured. The Egyptians had no concept of unwanted children. Infanticide was not practiced. Babies, both boys and girls, were celebrated at birth. Infants were carried everywhere by their mothers for the first 3 or 4 years, nursed and carefully watched to keep them safe from the very real dangers of life along the Nile. Rivers have crocodiles, deserts have snakes and scorpions. Diseases run through communities. Child mortality was high, devastatingly high by modern standards, and so every child who survived was precious. The house itself often had a small shrine or niche dedicated to household gods, Bes and Taweret. These are not the grand deities of temples and state religion. These are intimate, personal gods. Bes was depicted as a dwarf, bearded and strange-looking, often shown playing musical instruments or dancing. He protected children. He warded off evil spirits. He made homes feel safe and happy. Taweret was even more specific in her role. She looked like a pregnant hippopotamus standing upright, a bizarre combination of hippo, crocodile and lion features, and she protected women during pregnancy and childbirth. Because childbirth in the ancient world was one of the most dangerous things a woman could experience, no modern medicine, no anesthesia, no antibiotics if infection set in. Women died in childbirth regularly and newborns died even more frequently. So families prayed to Taweret. They kept small figurines of her in the bedroom. They invoked her name during labour. They desperately believed that she would protect mother and child. And children who survived those first dangerous years grew up within the household, learning by watching and helping. Boys would follow their fathers, learning whatever trade or profession the father practiced. By 6 or 7, a boy was already helping, already contributing in small ways. By puberty, he was competent enough to begin earning to contribute meaningfully to the family income. Girls learned from their mothers, cooking, grinding grain, weaving, managing a household. These were not minor skills. These were essential life competencies. A woman who could not manage a household well would struggle to find a good husband. So mothers taught daughters everything they needed to know, and here is something both touching and painful. Children went naked until around age 6, not out of poverty, though poor families certainly could not afford clothing for everyone, but because this was simply the norm. Children ran around naked playing in the streets and yards, and nobody thought it strange. Hair was often shaved to prevent lice except for a side lock worn by boys on one side of the head. This side lock, called the lock of youth, was cut off when the boy reached adolescence, marking his transition toward manhood. These small rituals, these physical markers of life stages, helped structure childhood and give it meaning. But families were not just about practicalities. They were about love, about connection, about the bonds that made life worth living. Tomb inscriptions express this over and over. Husbands writing about their grief at losing beloved wives, parents expressing their longing to be reunited with their children in the afterlife. One text from the tomb of Jehuti says to the god Amun, "May you grant that I go down to the beautiful west and join my father and mother." Another from the tomb of Reni states, "See now he belongs to his brothers and sisters and is with his brothers and sisters." These are not formulaic religious phrases. These are expressions of genuine emotional attachment. These are people who could not imagine an afterlife without their families, and the Egyptians took family obligations seriously. Children were expected to care for aging parents, to provide for them when they could no longer work, to oversee their eventual funerals and maintain their tombs. This reciprocity was fundamental. Parents cared for children when young children cared for parents when old, and children would eventually ensure their parents' names were remembered, which was itself a form of immortality. To be forgotten was the real death. To be remembered by your family, to have your name spoken, to have offerings left at your tomb that was eternal life. Letter writing between family members reveals so much about these relationships. We have letters from Deir el-Medina, that artisan village we keep returning to, where husbands wrote to wives, children wrote to parents, siblings corresponded with each other. And the tone in these letters is familiar, affectionate, sometimes humorous. Complaints about daily annoyances, expressions of affection, requests for specific items, worries about health. These letters sound exactly like letters any family might exchange today. The specifics change, the technology changes, but the underlying human emotions are identical. Families ate together. At the end of the day, after all the work was finished, the household would gather for the evening meal. Bread and beer as always, maybe some vegetables. If the family was prosperous, perhaps some fish or even meat. They would sit together, probably on the floor or on low stools, sharing food and conversation, telling stories, discussing the day, laughing at jokes, disciplining children, planning for the future. All the ordinary, extraordinary things that families do when they come together. And then there was the quiet of the evening, the sun finally down, the heat of the day dissipating, children settling down to sleep, parents perhaps having a few moments of peace before exhaustion overtook them. Maybe a husband and wife would sit together talking softly, enjoying the companionable silence that comes when two people know each other deeply. Or maybe they were too tired to talk, just grateful to be done with another day, grateful to be alive, grateful to have each other and their children and a roof overhead. Because life in ancient Egypt was hard. There is no romanticizing that. Most people worked physically demanding jobs for long hours. Food was adequate but not abundant. Medical care was limited. Death was present in ways we cannot imagine today. And yet within all that difficulty, people found joy. They found meaning. They found love. They created families and built homes and passed on their values to their children, generation after generation after generation for 3,000 years. The family, this simple unit of parents and children bound by affection and obligation, was the bedrock of everything. It was more important than the pharaoh, more important than the temples, more important than any monument or conquest or achievement, because the family was where life actually happened, where people were born and grew and loved and died, where memories were made and traditions passed down, where humanity in all its messy, beautiful complexity expressed itself most fully. And as the lamps flicker low, as voices quiet to murmurs and then to silence, as one more day in ancient Egypt draws to a close, these families rest, secure in their mud brick homes, protected, they believe, by household gods and by each other, ready to wake again when Ra's journey brings light back to the two lands. But for now, in this moment, as darkness settles over the Nile Valley, there is only this: the warmth of home, the presence of loved ones, the profound, simple comfort of belonging. And soon, very soon, night will take them all into its embrace, and the mysteries of sleep and dreams will transport them to realms beyond this world. Smoke rises from courtyards across the city, thin wisps curling upward in the cooling air, carrying the smell of cooking bread and stewed vegetables, and if you are lucky, perhaps fish or meat. This is the smell of evening in ancient Egypt, the smell of the day's labor finally ending, the smell of families gathering, the smell of the most important meal, the one that brings everyone together after hours of separation and work. Dinner was not just sustenance, it was ritual, it was connection. It was the moment when the household, fragmented by the demands of the day, became whole again. For most Egyptian families, the evening meal was prepared in an open courtyard behind the house. Not inside, because cooking indoors with open fires was dangerous and smoky and impractical. So the cooking happened outside under the sky, in spaces equipped with simple but effective tools. A wood-fired oven, essentially a cylindrical clay structure encased in thick mud brick. A grinding stone for any last-minute grain processing. Storage jars for water, oil, beer, and a woman, usually the mother or wife, overseeing the preparation. Let me be clear about something. Cooking in ancient Egypt was hard work. There were no convenience foods, no pre-made anything. Everything was created from raw ingredients through manual labour. If you wanted bread, and you always wanted bread because bread was life, someone had to grind grain into flour by hand, using a saddle, quern, a stone implement that required you to kneel and push another stone back and forth, crushing the grain little by little. Your shoulders would ache, your knees would hurt from kneeling, and inevitably sand and grit from the grinding stones would mix into the flour, which is why so many Egyptian mummies have teeth worn almost flat. Decades of eating gritty bread literally ground their teeth down. But once you had flour, you could make bread, and Egyptian bread came in astonishing variety. Not just simple flat loaves, though those existed too, but bread in different shapes: conical, cylindrical, round, triangular, even shaped like animals or human figures for ritual purposes. Some bread was sweetened with honey or dates, some had seeds on top, some was fluffy and leavened, some was dense and heavy. The Egyptians had been perfecting bread for thousands of years, and they knew what they were doing. The typical evening meal for a working family was simple but satisfying. Fresh bread still warm from the oven, beer, that thick, nutritious beer that was more like liquid food than beverage. Stewed vegetables, usually including onions, because onions were everywhere and grew abundantly. Maybe some lentils or beans for protein. Maybe some fish if someone had been fishing, or if they had traded for it at the market. Eggs occasionally from domesticated ducks or geese. And if it was a special day, a festival or celebration, perhaps some meat. Poultry, most likely. Beef was expensive, reserved for the wealthy or for ritual occasions. People did not use utensils. They ate with their fingers, sitting on mats woven from reeds or on low stools if the family could afford them, and they would rinse their hands between different foods, washing fingers in small bowls of water that might be scented with aromatics. This was practical, but also social. Eating together, sharing food from communal dishes created bonds. It reinforced family unity in a tangible physical way. Wealthier families had more elaborate meals. They might have servants preparing multiple courses. They could afford meat more regularly. They might have imported delicacies, fruits from distant regions, spices that poor families never tasted. Cumin and coriander were relatively common, but cinnamon, that came from far away and cost accordingly. Wine instead of beer, red or white, sometimes sweetened with honey or flavoured with spices. These families would eat at small individual tables brought to each person sitting on chairs, rather than the floor, demonstrating their status through their dining arrangements. But regardless of wealth, the evening meal served the same fundamental purpose. It gathered the family. It created a space for conversation, for the exchange of news and stories, for parents to teach children, for bonds to be reinforced through shared experience, and the stories that must have been told around those evening meals. Because the Egyptians loved storytelling. They had no television, obviously, no books that most people could read, no internet or podcasts or any of the entertainment technologies we take for granted. What they had was the oral tradition, the art of narrative passed down through generations, polished and refined by countless tellings. They told tales of the gods. How Ra travelled through the underworld each night battling the serpent Apophis to ensure the sun would rise again. how Isis searched for the pieces of her murdered husband Osiris and brought him back to life, how Horus avenged his father and became king. These were not just religious stories, they were adventure tales, epic narratives with drama and conflict and resolution. They explained the world while entertaining. They told stories of great pharaohs, military victories, building projects, the wisdom of ancient kings. These stories preserved history, yes, but they also taught values. They showed children what bravery looked like, what wisdom meant, what leadership required. They connected the present generation to their ancestors, creating continuity across time, and they told personal stories, family histories, the time grandfather outwitted a merchant in the marketplace, the time grandmother survived a crocodile attack, the time uncle fell in the Nile and nearly drowned but was saved by a passing fisherman. These stories were funny and frightening and meaningful. They kept deceased relatives alive in memory. They taught lessons about caution and courage and cleverness. They made children feel part of something larger than themselves. Ghost stories were popular too. The Egyptians loved a good supernatural tale, stories of spirits who returned from the dead with unfinished business, stories of curses and hauntings and magical protections. These were entertainment, certainly, but they also reinforced religious beliefs. They reminded everyone that death was not the end, that the spiritual world was real and present and powerful. After the meal, after the stories, as full darkness settled over the land, people would sometimes just sit quietly, enjoying the cool of the evening, listening to night sounds, the distant barking of dogs, the chirping of insects, the occasional cry of a night bird, the murmur of neighbours' voices from nearby houses, and they would look up at the stars. The Egyptian night sky was spectacular. No light pollution, no smog, just crystalline clarity, and thousands upon thousands of stars blazing overhead. The Milky Way stretching like a river of light across the heavens. And the Egyptians, practical and spiritual in equal measure, saw patterns in those stars. They recognized constellations, though not always the same ones we identify today. They tracked the movements of planets and bright stars. They knew that Sirius the dog star would appear on the eastern horizon just before sunrise at a certain time of year, and that this appearance signaled the coming Nile flood. They called Sirius Sothis, and believed it was the soul of the goddess Isis. They saw Orion, and believed it was the soul of Osiris. They identified 36 Deacon constellations along the horizon, groups of stars that rose at specific intervals throughout the year. These deacons were used to track time at night, a kind of stellar clock. Temple priests, the hour priests, would observe the stars from designated viewing areas on the temple roofs, noting which deacons were rising, calculating the hours until dawn. But for ordinary families, stargazing was simpler, more contemplative. A father might point out bright stars to his children, teaching them names and stories. A mother might recite poetry about the night sky, verses passed down from her own mother. A couple might sit close together, fingers intertwined, looking upward in companionable silence, thinking about the vastness of it all, their own small place in the cosmic order, the strange, beautiful mystery of existence. Because the Egyptians understood something profound. They understood that human life was brief, but connected to something eternal. The stars had been there before they were born and would remain after they died. The Nile had flowed for uncounted ages and would continue flowing. The cycle of day and night, planting and harvest, birth and death, all of it was part of Mayat, the great ordering principle that gave meaning to everything. And sitting there in the cooling darkness, full of food, and surrounded by family, perhaps worn out from a long day, but satisfied with having lived it well, an ancient Egyptian could feel that sense of order, could feel secure in knowing their place, could rest in the assurance that life, for all its difficulties, still made sense, still had purpose, still connected them to the gods and the ancestors and the yet unborn descendants who would someday sit in this same spot looking at these same stars, continuing the great unbroken chain of human existence. Children would grow drowsy, small heads nodding, eyes drooping despite their best efforts to stay awake and listen to one more story. Parents would notice, would exchange knowing glances, would gently shepherd the little ones inside, laying them on sleeping mats, covering them with light linen sheets, whispering blessings over them, asking Bess and Tawara to watch over them through the night, asking the household gods to keep evil spirits away, making sure every child felt safe and loved and protected. And then the adults might sit a while longer, talking quietly about tomorrow's tasks, about worries and hopes, about the practical details of keeping a household running, but also maybe about deeper things, about mortality and meaning, about what they hoped for their children, about their own eventual deaths and the afterlife they believed awaited them. Because the Egyptians thought about death constantly, not morbidly, but practically as simply the next phase of existence. And having a good death, a proper burial, a well-prepared tomb, these were important. These ensured you would continue, that you would be remembered, that your name would endure. Gradually conversation would fade, exhaustion would win, and one by one the family would retreat inside, into the small mud brick house that was their refuge from the world, into the dimness lit by oil lamps or perhaps just moonlight through the high windows, into their sleeping spaces onto mats or wooden bed frames with linen mattresses if they could afford them, finding their positions, the comfortable, familiar ways their bodies settled after years of sleeping in the same spots. And the house would quiet, breathing would slow and deepen. The day with all its work and heat and noise and activity would finally release its hold, and sleep, that mysterious little death that the Egyptians understood as a journey, would take them, would carry them off to the realm of dreams where anything was possible, where the gods might speak, where the boundary between life and death became thin and permeable, where the soul, freed temporarily from the body, could wander and experience and learn things the waking mind could never access. And there in that space between waking and sleeping, between day and night, between life and the afterlife, the ancient Egyptians would finally rest. One more day complete, one more cycle fulfilled, one more small confirmation that Ma'at still held that order, still prevailed, that tomorrow the sun would rise again, and the great eternal rhythm of existence would continue, as it had, as it always would, forever and ever without end. Sleep is stealing over the land. You can feel it happening, this gradual surrender. Breathing slows, muscles relax, the sharp edges of consciousness begin to soften and blur. And in ancient Egypt, this moment between waking and sleeping was understood not as nothing but as something profound, a transition, a journey, a temporary death. Because the Egyptians did not think of sleep the way we do. For us, sleep is rest, downtime, the body recharging batteries. But for them, sleep was when the soul left the body and travelled to the Duat, the underworld, that mysterious parallel realm that existed alongside the world of the living. Every night, without exception, every person in Egypt experienced a small version of death. And every morning when they woke, they experienced resurrection. The daily cycle of sleep and waking was practice for the ultimate journey they would all take eventually. The soul itself was not a simple thing, not a single unified entity like we might imagine. No, the Egyptians understood it as complex, multifaceted, composed of several distinct parts. The Ka, your life force, your spiritual double, created at birth and lasting beyond death. The Be, your personality, your individuality. Everything that made you uniquely you depicted in art as a human-headed bird capable of flying between worlds. The Ak formed when Ka and Ba reunited after death, the perfected transfigured being you would become in the afterlife. Your Ren, your name, which had to be preserved and spoken for you to continue existing. Your shadow, your physical presence, your heart, the seat of consciousness and morality which would be judged. All of these pieces working together made you whole, and at night when you slept your Ba would leave your body and journey into the Duat. It would travel, it would experience things the waking mind could not access. It would encounter gods and demons, traverse dangerous landscapes, face trials and challenges. This is what dreams were. Not random neural firings, not meaningless images generated by a sleeping brain, but actual experiences your bear was having in the spiritual realm. And here is what strikes me as beautiful. The Egyptians believed that every night both the living and the dead made the same journey. When you slept, your Ba joined the Ba of your deceased ancestors, and the Ba of everyone else currently sleeping, all travelling together through the underworld. You were not separated from the dead. You met them nightly. You existed alongside them in this parallel realm. Death was not a final separation. It was just a permanent relocation to a place you already visited every single night of your life. The sun god Ra also made this journey. Every evening when the sun set in the west, Ra descended into the Duat and travelled through it during the 12 hours of night, battling the chaos serpent Apophis, who tried to destroy him, ensuring that dawn would come, that order would prevail over chaos, that Ma'at would continue. And every living Egyptian sleeping in their small mud brick houses was symbolically making that same journey with Ra, experiencing the same dangers, fighting the same battles, participating in the cosmic drama that kept the universe functioning. This is why dreams mattered so much. Dreams were not fantasies, they were messages, prophecies, warnings, communications from the gods or from deceased family members. If you dreamed of something specific, there were priests who could interpret it, tell you what it meant, what action you should take. Dream interpretation was a legitimate profession, a sacred skill. The Egyptians even had dream books, papyrus scrolls that listed common dreams and their meanings, though unfortunately most have not survived. But the ultimate journey, the one every Egyptian spent their life preparing for, was death itself. The permanent journey. When your physical body died, when your Ka and Ba separated from your physical form, you would begin the most important trip you would ever take, through the Duat, past magical creatures and lakes of fire and gates guarded by fearsome demons. Each gate had a guardian, and to pass through you needed to know that guardian's name, speak it correctly, prove you had the right to proceed. This is where the Book of the Dead came in. Not actually a book, but a collection of spells, over 200 of them written on papyrus scrolls and placed in tombs with the deceased. These spells were like a guidebook, a manual for navigating the afterlife. Spells to protect you from dangerous creatures. Spells to help you remember who you are. Spells to prevent you from dying a second death in the underworld, because yes, it was possible to die again permanently, and that was the real terror. The first death was just a transition. The second death was annihilation. Complete. Final. Your soul devoured, your name erased, your entire existence ending forever. And at the end of the journey, if you made it through all the dangers, you would face the ultimate test, the weighing of the heart. You would stand before Osiris, the god of the underworld, in the Hall of Two Truths, and your heart, the seat of your consciousness and morality, would be placed on a scale and weighed against the feather of Ma'at, the feather of truth and justice. If your heart was light, if you had lived a good and just life, if you had maintained Ma'at in your actions and thoughts, the scales would balance. you would pass judgment. You would be allowed to enter the field of reeds, the Egyptian paradise where life continued much as it had on earth, but perfect, eternal, without suffering or want. But if your heart was heavy with wrongdoing, with lies and cruelty and chaos, the scales would tip, and a meter demon composed of crocodile, lion, and hippopotamus parts would devour your heart. You would cease to exist, this second death, permanent obliteration. This was the fate Egyptians feared more than anything, not hell in the sense of eternal punishment, but simply ending, disappearing, being forgotten. This is why they mummified bodies to preserve the physical form so the bar would have somewhere to return to. This is why they built elaborate tombs and filled them with food and drink and possessions to provide for the car. This is why they carved names into stone to ensure the wren would endure. This is why families maintained tombs and left offerings and spoke the names of the dead. Every element of Egyptian funerary practice was designed to prevent the second death to ensure continued existence. And lying there in the darkness on sleeping mats or simple beds, an Egyptian family at the end of this long day we've spent together, they would have understood all of this. They would have known that sleep was not just rest. It was rehearsal, practice for the ultimate journey. Every night they died a little. Every morning they were reborn. And when the final death came, it would feel familiar, not foreign, not terrifying in the way it might be for us who think of sleep and death as completely separate things. For them, sleep and death were points on the same continuum, the same process, just different durations. So as consciousness fades, as the last thoughts of the day drift away like smoke, as sleep claims them fully, these ancient Egyptians were not afraid. They were prepared. They had been making this journey their entire lives, and tonight, like every night, they would descend into the Duat. They would travel alongside Ra. They would meet their ancestors. They would see glimpses of the paradise that awaited them if they lived well. They would experience mysteries that the waking mind could never comprehend. And in the morning they would return, the bar flying back to reunite with the car, consciousness returning, another day beginning, another chance to live according to Ma'at, another opportunity to prepare their souls for eternity. The house is silent now, everyone sleeping, the oil lamps extinguished, just the faint glow of stars through the high windows, and outside across the Nile Valley millions of others are sleeping too, all of them journeying together through the darkness, all of them small threads in an enormous cosmic tapestry that has been weaving itself since the beginning of time and will continue long after they are gone. They are part of something eternal, part of the great cycle, part of Ma'at, and so ends our day in ancient Egypt, a single day, 24 hours. From dawn, when Ra began his journey across the sky through the heat, and work of midday through evening and storytelling and stargazing into night and sleep and dreams. Just one day. But in that day, an entire civilization, a complete world. People who loved and struggled and laughed and cried and built and created and believed and hoped. People who were as human as we are, as complex, as contradictory, as capable of beauty and cruelty and everything in between. 3,000 years separate us from them. 3,000 years of history and change and technological advancement. But lying in the darkness, surrendering to sleep, travelling in dreams to mysterious realms, we cannot quite remember upon waking we're doing exactly what they did. The same human experience unchanged across millennia. Sleep remains a mystery. Death remains a mystery. And in facing those mysteries, we're still asking the same questions they asked. What happens when we die? Where do we go? Will we see our loved ones again? Is there meaning to all of this? Do our lives matter? The ancient Egyptians answered those questions with pyramids and papyrus, with mummies and monuments, with art and architecture that has endured for thousands of years. They answered with a profound belief in continuity, in the persistence of consciousness, in the importance of being remembered. And whether you believe in their specific afterlife or not, there is something powerful in their conviction, something that speaks to the deep human need to believe that we are more than just bodies, that love transcends death, that the story does not end when the heart stops beating. Thank you for spending this day with me in ancient Egypt. Thank you for walking these streets, meeting these people, seeing this world through their eyes. I hope you feel a connection to them now. I hope you understand that they were not so different from us, that despite the vast gulf of time separating us, we're all part of the same human family, all asking the same questions, all seeking the same things: love, meaning, legacy, a sense that our brief time here matters. The ancient Egyptians believed that to be remembered was to live forever, that as long as someone spoke your name you continued to exist. Well, tonight we have spoken their names, we have remembered their world, and in doing so we have given them a small measure of the immortality they worked so hard to achieve. They live if only for this moment in our imagination and our hearts. Sleep well. May your own journey through the night be peaceful. May your dreams be gentle and revealing. And may you wake renewed like the ancient Egyptians did, ready to face another day, another chance to live according to your own values, to create your own meaning, to build something that might endure beyond your brief time on this earth. Until next time, when we will explore another place, another time, another fascinating chapter of human history. Thank you for listening. Thank you for being here, and may Matt guide your path now and always. Good night.